Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe beneath flickering torches and into the shadowed corridors of Angkor Thom, the immense walled city once known as the divine navel of the Khmer Empire. The moon is high, painting everything in silverstone lions, banyan roots, even the empty eyes of sandstone apsaras carved along temple walls. The scent in the air is a humid mix of incense, sweat, and something just a little rusty. You're here for justice, but not the kind with powdered wigs and polite gavels, no. This is Khmer justice, where punishment isn't only about correction. It's theater. It's fear. It's an art. You stand among a restless crowd, peasants in woven palm hats, and silk-robed nobles with lips pursed tight. A drum sounds from within the victory gate, slow and deliberate, as if the city itself has a heartbeat. You glance sideways and realize everyone's looking toward a wooden platform at the edge of the square. Something's about to happen. Someone's about to pay a very physical price for stepping out of line. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time. I love seeing how far we're traveling together each night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward slowly, past a mango vendor, nervously clutching his wares. The crowd parts slightly, and you spot the accused young, barefoot, eyes hollow. His hands are bound with lotus fiber, and a sign hangs around his neck. You can't read it, but the villagers whisper that he's a thief. Stole from a temple, which, if you're familiar with Khmer legal customs, is like stealing sacred feet's going to get noticed. Justice in the empire flows from both divine decree and royal authority. The king, considered semi-divine himself, delegates power to provincial officials, warrior monks, and the occasionally terrifying priest-judge hybrid. They don't all agree on every method of punishment. The historians still argue whether regional variations reflect localized law or chaotic improvisation. But they all agree on one thing: punishment should be memorable. The drums stop. A man steps onto the platform, a judge, draped in crimson and gold, with a look that suggests he hasn't blinked since the rainy season started. He recites a chant in Old Khmer, calling upon celestial deities, ancestral kings, and oddly enough a crocodile. The crowd stirs, the thief sways, you feel your stomach twist. A trumpet blares, the judge points, and the accused is led away not to a jail, but toward the eastern moat, where something sloshes just beneath the surface, the infamous crocodile moat. You follow at a cautious distance, curiosity gnawing at your better judgment. Now, here's the thing about this punishment. It wasn't always fatal. Sometimes it was symbolic. The accused might just be dunked once and yanked out again. Wet and humiliated, but very much alive. But if the crime was severe, if the crocodile was particularly peckish, well, the outcome changed. Remember, Khmer punishment often depended as much on interpretation as intention. A broken statue? Maybe an accident. A missing statue head? Definitely treason. Good luck convincing anyone otherwise. Tonight's verdict seems serious. The young man is lowered into the water on a crude rope sling. There's a moment of silence, broken only by the croak of frogs and the whispered prayers of villagers clutching amulets carved from sandalwood. You look down. The water ripples. And then a tail. A flash of teeth. A scream that gets cut off halfway through. The crowd gasps. One old woman nods solemnly and mutters, "Karma. A fringe detail you overhear?" Some claim that officials used to starve the moat crocodiles intentionally before these events. Gave the public something exciting, kept the reptiles invested in the program. A sort of medieval snack subscription model. Others say the moat was simply unlucky, and its reputation snowballed. Either way, that poor man, he's not coming back up. The crowd begins to disperse. Kids chase each other with mock screams, adults return to their market stalls, and two bored guards start a heated debate about whether a crocodile bite counts as divine will or just good aim. You, meanwhile, are a little shaky. You didn't expect your evening walk to involve reptiles and vigilante splash zones. As you return to the city center, you pass a shrine where villagers leave offerings, banana leaf packets, jasmine garlands, half-burned incense. The smell is oddly comforting, a reminder that even in the harshest systems, people still pray for mercy, for clarity, for some understanding that justice might one day be more than spectacle. You lean against a sandstone lion, its mouth curled in an eternal snarl, and try to process what you've just seen. In Khmer culture, punishment wasn't just punitive, it was cosmic. The harmony of the kingdom depended on balance. A crime tilted that balance. And so something had to be done. And done publicly. Still, not every punishment was about blood and beasts. Sometimes it was ritual humiliation like public shaving, or wearing humiliating signs, or worse, being paraded through the market in an outfit stitched entirely from banana peels. There's a reason that phrase stuck around for centuries. You'd think a society that built Angkor Wat would shy away from slapstick punishments, but no. If anything, they had a flair for spectacle, a solid blend of divine wrath and street theater. And so you continue walking, the sounds of the square now muffled by the jungle's breath. Somewhere, a cicada drones. A monkey screeches from a rooftop. You glance over your shoulder and see, for just a second, the outline of a crocodile watching the torches from the moat's edge, its eyes glowing amber. No, you definitely wouldn't have survived that trial. But hey, there's always tomorrow night. You wake up to a rooster that sounds like it's coughing up gravel, and a heat that starts baking your skin before the sun even finishes rising. You're still in Angkor Thom, but this morning has a new rhythm. Traders shuffle into the square. Monks chant from the direction of Bayon Temple, and behind the palace wall, there's already noise guards shouting, a drumbeat, and a cart being dragged by oxen with less enthusiasm than you currently feel. You rub your eyes and squint toward the riverbank. The crowd's gathering again. You follow the flow of bodies through narrow alleys choked with lemongrass smoke and gossip. Everyone's muttering about the accused. A palace cook, apparently. Rumor says he stole royal rice, or insulted a minor deity, or maybe just burned the fish sauce too many times. No one knows the exact crime, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is what's going to happen next. You round the corner, and there it is, the crocodile moat. Again, it's broader than you remember, more like a sleepy lagoon with lotus flowers lazily drifting along the edge. But then your eyes adjust, and you see movement barely a ripple at first, then a long, smooth shape gliding beneath the surface like a rumor in the dark. The crocodiles are real, and very much awake. A pair of guards haul the cook forward. He's barefoot, sweaty, muttering something you can't hear. His hands are bound in front, and he wears the standard issue shame garb, a sarong too tight, a headdress of woven reeds, and a placard across his chest. It's scrawled with Khmer script and a drawing that, from your angle, looks suspiciously like an angry fish. Now, this punishment isn't quite execution. Not always. This is more like the Khmer version of Russian roulette, part trial by ordeal, part fear theater, and all designed to remind everyone watching that the king's justice never sleeps. If you survive the moat, some say, it means the gods have spared you. Others argue it just means the crocodiles weren't hungry. Historians still argue whether the crocodile moat was used regularly, or more, as a legendary deterrent. Some believe its fame outweighed its frequency, a tale whispered by village elders to scare naughty kids. Others claim the moat had rotating inmates, actual crocodiles, gifted to the king from remote provinces, kept lean and mean for moments just like this. Today, the ceremony starts with a gong, then a short sermon by a priest dressed in dazzling orange silk and a hat that looks suspiciously like it's made of old bamboo placemats. He chants a few lines from the Angkor, invokes ancestral spirits, and waves a censer full of fragrant smoke that smells like cinnamon, sandalwood, and vengeance. Then the judge appears. He's tall, robed in deep purple, and carries a staff that looks like it's carved from petrified snake. His face is unreadable, save for the smallest upward twitch of his left eyebrow, a universal signal that someone is about to have a really bad day. He doesn't say much, just points at the moat and nods. The guards step forward, securing the cook to a bamboo frame, basically a glorified swing set with ropes attached to either side. They lower him down over the water, just above the surface. His feet dangle. His breathing's loud enough to make birds scatter. And then it happens. The water moves, slowly, gracefully, a crocodile rises. Its eyes break the surface first, golden and glassy, then the snout, then the ridged back, covered in algae and scars. It glides toward the man in utter silence. You hold your breath. The crowd leans in. Someone drops a mango, and then nothing. The crocodile sniffs, snorts, turns, and drifts away. A murmur ripples through the crowd. The priest nods with satisfaction, the judge frowns slightly, and the cook starts sobbing with something that might be gratitude, fear, or a total emotional collapse. Probably all three. He's yanked back up to the platform, drenched and shaking. The guards untie him, slap a wet towel across his shoulders, and lead him off without a word. You blink. That's it? Turns out, yes. He was spared. For now, probably reassigned to latrine duty for eternity, but still technically breathing. That's a win in this city. As the crowd disperses, you hear someone muttering, "Must have worn crocodile oil under his tunic." And sure enough, there's an old jungle remedy said to make your scent unappealing to reptiles, some mix of lemongrass, garlic, and buffalo dung. You're not sure if it works, but you're definitely not trying it out. The concept of trial by ordeal isn't unique to the Khmer. Cultures across history have dunked people in rivers, made them walk on coals, or swallow sacred objects to test innocence. But here, in this empire of towering temples and precise engineering, the spectacle is uniquely Khmer, visceral, aquatic, and performed beneath the gaze of gods carved into every lintel. You wander back to the market, the smell of grilled jackfruit following you. A merchant offers you roasted crickets on a skewer. You pass, still thinking about the cook's shaking legs, the croc's bored expression, and the way everyone just returned to normal like that wasn't a potential dismemberment situation. You pause near a shrine and drop a flower at the base. Not for the cook, really. Just for the idea of him, for all the near misses, the brush with death moments, the invisible line between punishment and survival. Somewhere in the trees, the crocodile watches again, half submerged and wholly uninterested in your flower. You step away, eyes still wide, heart still thudding, and a very clear mental note. Never, ever steal the royal rice. You wander further from the market square, still wiping sweat from your neck with a strip of cotton that gave up being helpful an hour ago. The air thickens as you leave the main road and slip into a side path overgrown with weeds, and the occasional barefoot child darting between stilt houses. There's a strange hush in this part of Angkor Thom. No drums. No traders yelling over jackfruit prices. Just the lazy drone of insects and the faint clang of a distant blacksmith keeping time with your steps. Then, you hear Itlo voices, not chanting but arguing. You round a corner and find a clearing shaded by an enormous Bodhi tree, its limbs sagging under the weight of history and humidity. At its base, a circle of elders and a few guards are gathered around a bundle that doesn't look like a bundle at all once your eyes adjust. It's a person, kneeling, bound, their head bowed, their hair shorn unevenly, with a carved wooden post rising behind them. You edge closer through the trees and catch a glimpse of something that makes your stomach dip. Dangling from the branches above, nearly blending into the leaves, are what at first look like gourds, or maybe odd woven bundles. But then one slowly turns in the breeze, and you see the unmistakable grin of a skull, jaw slightly open like it's telling a punchline from beyond the grave. You found the tree of skulls. The accused today is a soldier, someone whispers, caught looting a sacred temple outside the city, took silver bowls, possibly drank palm wine from them, possibly worse. Desecrating temple property wasn't just a crime, it was spiritual vandalism, an offense that didn't just offend law, but the spirits and gods themselves. And Khmer justice? It rarely offered second chances when ghosts got involved. The Bodhi tree in Khmer tradition symbolizes enlightenment, compassion, rebirth and, in cases like this, a not-so-gentle reminder of consequence. The skulls aren't just for shock. They're trophies, warnings, and sacred objects all at once. Historians still argue whether these trees were actually used for display regularly, or if this particular one became famous through a mix of myth and morbid reputation. Either way, standing beneath it now, you don't feel particularly comforted. The elder presiding over the judgment is barely taller than his staff, but speaks with the force of a monsoon. His words rise and fall like a ritual, though you catch the tone more than the content. Condemnation, ceremony, and then finality. The accused doesn't cry, doesn't plead, just kneels there as the sentence is read. They've been found guilty of defiling a temple, stealing from the divinian. For this, they'll join the tree. Not by hanging. That would be too clean. No, they're going to be displayed. First, the punishment starts with public shaving hair, eyebrows, everything. Humiliation by visibility. Then they're bound to the base of the tree in a crouched position, hands behind their back, where they'll remain for days. During this time, they're fed nothing but salted rice cakes and rainwater. Not enough to die, just enough to deeply regret their life choices. Eventually, when the sun has blistered their skin and the insects have done their part, they're either executed or die naturally from exposure. What happens after is the grim finale. Their skull, cleaned and decorated with red dye, is hoisted into the tree. A bone offering, a lesson, a face among many. You watch, half horrified, half hypnotized, as the guards begin wrapping rope around the soldier's legs. You imagine the days ahead for him, bitten by ants, scorched by sun, jeered by passing children. No comfort. No redemption. Just the slow realization that stealing from a temple is not worth this. Not even if the wine was spectacular. A priest circles the tree, brushing ash on each visible skull. The air smells sweet jasmine, tamarind, a touch of rotting fruit, oddly pleasant for a place of such grim ritual. And it hits you. The Khmer didn't separate the beautiful from the brutal. They wove them together. Ceremony and cruelty danced hand in hand. A punishment wasn't just about suffering. It was about narrative, message, symbolism that outlasted the person. You catch a glimpse of one of the older skulls. There's a red flower tucked behind the left eye socket, a fresh bloom. Someone remembered, or maybe someone celebrated. Not all who ended up here were condemned out of malice. Some were enemies of the state. Some were seen as rebels, prophets, criminal sore, depending on who was in power, inconvenient thinkers. Fringe accounts mention scholars punished for writing unapproved verses. One tale even speaks of a poet who insulted a royal elephant and ended up a permanent tree ornament. You back away slowly, unsure where awe ends and fear begins. A child runs past you, shouting something about mangoes and ghosts. You don't follow. You've had enough spirits for the day. Winding your way back through the outer streets of Angkor Thom, you notice more trees than you realized before, each one ancient, sprawling, with vines like veins. Any of them could be another such tree. Some may have held skulls. Some might still. But you're not eager to find out. You stop by a food stall and buy a warm rice cake, still salty from earlier punishment inspiration. As you nibble it, you wonder how many other travelers stood where you did, looking up at the tree of skulls, hoping their face wouldn't be the next to grin down from the branches. Probably too many. Better finish the rice cake just in case. You don't know why the drums are beating again this soon, but something in the tempo feels different, urgent, louder. The kind of cadence that makes birds scatter from rooftops and vendors abandon half-sold jars of pickled mango without apology. You follow the crowd because of course you doe-drawn like a moth toward whatever fresh chaos is about to unfold in the plaza near the elephant stables. And there it is. An elephant. Two, actually. Massive, tusked, and painted in brilliant swirls of saffron and indigo. Their eyes look bored, but their handlers not so much. One clutches a bronze-tipped goad like it's just another morning at the office. The other is kneeling beside a small altar, whispering what sounds like a blessing, or an apology. The accused hasn't arrived yet, which gives you time to soak in the setting. This part of Angkor Thom is reserved for royal ceremonies, but sometimes, when justice demanded extra spectacle, it doubled as a public courtroom with elephants. Elephants were sacred to the Khmer, symbols of power, divine right, and in some cases, divine vengeance. When an elephant was involved in a punishment, it wasn't just about crushing bones. It was about reinforcing the idea that the empire didn't just punish it crushed with cosmic authority. Historians still argue whether these executions were scripted from start to finish, or if they left room for elephant improvisation. One account suggests trained elephants could be taught to toy with the condemned first breaking bones, carefully, slowly. Others believe it was far more immediate. A single order from the mahout followed by one swift, grotesque step. A hushfaz. The accused is led in arms bound behind the back, ankles dragging slightly, face pale as moonlight. You can't tell what they did yet, but judging by the presence of elephants and royal guards in full regalia, it wasn't minor. Someone whispers, "Slandered the crown prince." Another voice says, "Poisoned a rice offering." A third swears they spat on a statue of Garuda. Probably none of them know. Doesn't really matter now. The judge arrives. This time on horseback, flanked by drummers and an attendant holding a parasol carved with naga heads. He doesn't dismount, just lifts one arm, and the drumming stops. You hear every breath in the plaza. A scroll is read aloud, naming the condemned, recounting the crime, and listing the verdict, death by elephant. Specifically, under the left foot. Apparently, this matters. The accused is brought forward and placed rather unceremoniously in the ground in front of the larger elephant. The handlers don't rush. They've done this before. There's a rhythm to it binding the arms, placing a ceramic amulet under the body, adjusting the positioning so the foot lands just right. One handler even dusts the elephant's toe. You briefly wonder if that's for ritual purity or dramatic flair. A conch shell sounds. The elephant doesn't react at first, just blinks. Then the handler murmurs something low, taps its ear, and slowly agonizingly one massive leg rises. The crowd flinches before the foot even drops. You, wisely, turn away before impact. The sound is still very much audible, somewhere between a splat and a thud and a wet crunch that you don't want to think about. The crowd groans, then claps politely. A woman 2 feet from you says, "Well, at least it was quick." Sometimes, it wasn't. Some punishments involved elephants, trained to delay execution, pinning the person with a knee, twisting slightly, letting the condemned scream or confess, or simply wait for the mercy of pressure. But today, the sentence was clean, or at least, decisive. The body is quickly wrapped in reed mats and removed. The elephant is rewarded with a banana wrapped in betel leaf. The crowd starts to disperse. You remain, dazed. And yet, something tugs at you, a strange thought that maybe the elephant understood. That it wasn't just following orders, but participating in something ancient, regal, ritualized. A living embodiment of divine wrath in a very wrinkled, trunk-wiggling package. You wander away, past the outer walls of the square, where the shade is thick and the chatter less frantic. There, beneath a fig tree, you overhear two guards trading jokes about how the condemned almost rolled sideways, and the elephant had to adjust mid-step. Left foot's always the lucky one says, grinning. The other smirks. Only if you're not under it. You sit nearby and sip from a canteen, the water warm but soothing. The elephant punishment stays with you not because of the gore, which you were smart enough to avoid, but because of how accepted it was. No outrage. No gasps. Just another day in a system where justice could wear tusks and silk anklets. And that's the strange part. The punishment wasn't random. It was ceremonial. And while modern eyes might recoil, the Khmer saw it differently. The elephant didn't just kill it confirmed guilt. It reinforced cosmic order. It reminded everyone that some offenses could not be answered with bamboo rods or shaming parades. Some required the foot of heaven. You close your eyes for a moment and hear again the sound of the conch, the weighty silence before the command, the shuffle of giant feet. Maybe tomorrow's judgment will be lighter. But today was heavy. You drift away from the elephant square, with your thoughts still tangled around tusks and silence. But before your mind can fully settle, a new sound emerges, shallow pounding, like metal being hammered over a flame. Only this isn't blacksmithing. It's ceremonial. You follow it instinctively, drawn through a narrow corridor that opens into a small stone courtyard, half hidden behind a shrine to Vishnu. There, on a raised dais, a brazier glows white-hot. Flames lick upward, greedily eating air, and suspended over it, like some horrifying kitchen setup, is a small iron pot, already sweating with heat. Your gut does a little flip. You've stumbled into a punishment you've only heard of in the form of whispers and wincest the molten metal trial, often reserved for corrupt officials, especially those who stole royal funds or falsified tax records. If you're going to cheat the empire, you'd better not leave a paper trail, or at the very least, not one a monk can trace with a quill and a grudge. The crowd here is smaller, tighter, and mostly silent. You take a spot near a young monk who glances at you, but doesn't speak. He's got that seen too much look in his eyes, which is mildly alarming, considering he's probably 12. At the center of the space stands the accused, a palace scribe, hands trembling, robes too clean for comfort. You learn from the murmurings around you that he was caught altering tax roll, shaving off coinage, redirecting temple tributes, maybe even selling appointment titles for bribes, which, in the Khmer Empire, is a spectacular way to both lose your reputation and your ability to touch anything ever again. Now here's the twist: this punishment isn't always fatal, which makes it even more unsettling. The idea is this: the accused is given a final chance to demonstrate innocence by withstanding divine judgment. The molten metal, usually silver or leadus, either poured near them, presented in a searing hot ladle they must hold briefly, or, in extreme cases, used in symbolic branding across the palms. Historians still argue whether the goal was to physically punish or to allow for a kind of spiritual confession. Some records suggest the condemned was declared purified if they didn't scream or drop the implement. Others claim surviving the ordeal was considered proof of innocence, which, when you think about it, gives the accused a real incentive to lie still and clench through it all. Today's ceremony seems to fall in the partial mercy category. The accused is led to a stone block and knelt before the brazier. A priest chants nearby, tossing fragrant powder into the flame-seach puff of smoke, a ghost of sandalwood and tamarind. Two guards, wearing armor but clearly just as nervous as everyone else, lower the iron ladle into the coals. It turns orange, then red, then nearly white. The heat radiates out like a presence, like a second sun. A second priest steps forward and presents the accused with a small wooden talisman, a final chance to confess. He hesitates, breathes, and nods. You can't hear the words, but you can see his shoulders slump, his hands open willingly. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's surrender, maybe he figures it hurts less if you don't fight it. They press the ladle into his palm. The sound is sharp, a hiss, like meat on a pan. The man cries out, but not a scream more, like a breath punched from the lungs. He stays still, doesn't pull away. The priest counts aloud, slowly, in a language older than stone. 1, 2, 3. Then they lift it off. The hand is ruined, blistered, blackened, but attached, which, as far as Khmer punishments go, is weirdly optimistic. The priest announces that the gods have seen the confession and accepted his pain. The punishment is complete, no execution, just a new life as a marked man both physically and socially. In Khmer society, a branded hand wasn't just a wound. It was a scarlet letter, a living reminder that the empire never forgets. He's helped away by 2 monks. You watch him go, wondering how he'll live now. Not many places in the empire hire scribes who smell like charcoal. But who knows? Maybe he'll grow herbs. Maybe he'll teach kids what not to do. As you linger, the brazier is doused with water, releasing a plume of steam that rolls toward the sky like a ghost being exorcised. You step back as the crowd disperses. There's no cheering, no speeches, just that quiet understanding that justice, here, is not about rehabilitation. It's about memory. You glance down at your own hands. Clean. For now. Walking back toward the main road, you pass another small shrine, this one, devoted to Preah Pisnukar, the god of crafts and creation. You pause to wonder if the same divine hands that bless artists also judged the scribe's fingertips just now. There's something poetic about it, something unsettling too. By the time you reach the edge of the city's administrative quarter, the air is thick with sunset. Everything glows gold, even the flags, even the dust. A merchant calls out to you, offering iced rice milk with crushed lotus seed. You take one. It tastes cool and sweet, but a little metallic. You try not to overthink it. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you know what image will float up first, not the man's hand, but the moment just before, when he opened it, when he chose. That's the part that lingers. The air feels different today, heavier, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. You don't hear drums this time, no gongs, no fanfare, just the low buzz of the crowd forming along the marketplace road. This kind of punishment doesn't need theatrics. It speaks for itself. You squeeze between 2 vendors and see it. A man, middle-aged, shoulders slumped, walking slowly, barefoot, and naked except for a crumpled banana leaf that fails at modesty in every direction. Around his neck hangs a wooden plaque painted with symbols of shame. What looks like a goat, a basket, and something you think is a loaf of stolen rice. Someone thoughtfully added flies to the artwork. A guard walks behind him, shaking a small bell. Ding, ding, ding. The shame parade has begun. This was one of the Khmer Empire's favorite punishments for minor crimes: petty theft, slander, disrespect to an elder, that sort of thing. And while it didn't involve crocodiles or molten metal, it had its own particular sting. The sting of being seen, laughed at, ridiculed, remembered. The man doesn't cry. He just keeps walking, head bowed, hands bound loosely behind him with lotus stems soft enough not to cut, but tight enough to remind him this isn't just a morning stroll. A group of children follows him, chanting improvised rhymes and throwing wilted mango peels at his feet. It's equal parts justice and kindergarten chaos. A woman selling lemongrass hisses at him as he passes, muttering something about karma. Another vendor throws a handful of cold rice. It sticks to the man's back like wet regret. You can't help but notice how choreographed it all feels. There are guards, yes, but no one seems genuinely alarmed. This isn't about danger. It's about performance. Khmer punishments often balanced severity with symbolism, and shame parades were the ultimate combination of both. A walking warning, a moving reminder, and arguably, a deeply personal sort of torment. Historians still argue whether this practice functioned more as moral correction or civic theater. Some think it evolved from earlier ritual processions meant to cleanse the soul, eventually repurposed into civic punishment, once people realized how entertaining it was to watch their neighbor get publicly humiliated for stealing pickled tamarind. And the banana leaves? Not just about modesty. They were symbolic too, associated with impermanence, softness, and in this case, the fragility of dignity. If your leaf slipped off during the march, you didn't get a new one. The crowd would just cheer louder. The man reaches a small platform near the public well. He's instructed to kneel and apologize to the crowd. He does so quietly, voice hoarse and barely audible. A priest steps forward and recites a blessing, then hands him a cup of water from the well. That's the sign. The punishment is over. But the real punishment? That lasts longer. Because for weeks, sometimes months, this man will be the rice thief with the goat sign. Neighbors will smirk. Vendors will charge extra. Prospective in-laws will suddenly develop selective amnesia about previous conversations. The bell that clanged behind him might as well be tied to his ankle for life. You sit nearby, under the awning of a sugarcane juice stall, sipping something cold and sweet. The vendor, a grandmother with cloud-soft eyes, shakes her head and says, "He was a fool." Everyone knew the goat belonged to the monks. Apparently, the theft wasn't just any theft. The man had stolen food offered to a temple goat, part of a ritual donation. That explained the plaque's symbols. Stealing from monks wasn't just illegal, it was spiritually bankrupt. The kind of thing you do when you've really stopped caring whether the gods are watching. You ask the juice seller if the paraded man will face any further punishment. "No," she says. "His face will do the rest." She isn't wrong. In the Khmer Empire, reputation was currency, and the shame parade ensured that debt got repaid in full, loudly, colorfully, possibly with banana leaves. As you rise to leave, the old woman adds, "Sometimes they make them wear coconut husk shoes too. It blisters the feet." You glance at your own shoes, dusty but comfortable, and imagine walking barefoot through the hot streets with a crowd judging your every step. Not even for stealing, maybe, just for saying something stupid, or sneezing during a monk's sermon, or looking at someone's wife too long. The bar for punishment wasn't always written in stone. Sometimes it was whispered behind hands and enforced with bells. There's even a legend about a royal courtier who mocked a prince's poetry. He wasn't executed. Instead, he was paraded in a feathered robe, while village children recited his insult back to him in song. By the third day, he'd rewritten the poem in praise of the prince and stapled it to every temple wall. You head back toward the river, passing the now quiet crowd. The man is gone. So is the bell. But the story, that lingers in the air like incense smoke and afternoon heat. You sit under a Bodhi tree near the water and close your eyes, listening to the soft ripple of current and the laughter of children chasing a coconut. And for just a second, you hear it again ding. Ding, ding, and your shoulders tense reflexively. Better behave. You wake up to the strangest sound, a thick, wet squelch, like someone flipping fish on a muddy shore, followed by cheers and a yelp. It's not the usual market chatter or monthly chants. Something different is happening. Something involving water. And possibly something you won't enjoy. So you follow the noise, because of course you do. Curiosity is your curse. The trail leads you out past the edge of Angkor Thom, toward the overgrown perimeter where temples crumble quietly under vines and frogs outnumber people. A low wooden fence surrounds a shallow depression filled with murky water, a leech pool. A man is being lowered into it by a system of pulleys that seems far too complex for how much it clearly hates him. The crowd around the pit isn't huge. This punishment isn't flashy. It's slow, squirmy, personal, and apparently reserved for fraudsters, particularly those who scammed villagers or forged temple documents. You learn from a nearby silk trader that today's guest of honor is a tax collector who created imaginary rice shortages and then charged extra to fix them. Classic scam. Excellent way to end up itchy in all the wrong places. The Khmer were a proud people, skilled engineers, devout builders, intricate dancer sand. They did not enjoy being tricked. Fraud was more than a nuisance. It was destabilizing. Undermined harmony. Made the gods frown. So, if you got caught gaming the system, you didn't just lose your job. You earned a date with the lotus pit. Except this lotus pit is a leech pit. And yes, it's as gross as it sounds. The man, stripped to his loincloth, is now knee-deep in sludge, muttering prayers as attendants splash the water to wake the leeches. One priest walks the rim, chanting from a scroll. Another adds shredded banana flour to the pool, apparently a traditional way to agitate the parasites. Or maybe just insult them. You shift uncomfortably on your rock as the man's body starts to twitch. First, just a little, then a lot. Leeches aren't fast, but they are thorough. They seek warmth, vibration, anything that might be a good blood source. And the human body? That's an all-you-can-eat buffet. Within minutes, the man is covered in black, writhing passengers. His arms, legs, even his neck freckled with pulsing globs. He grunts, then cries out. The crowd flinches, but doesn't move. This is justice. Ugly, yes, but also oddly effective. The punishment lasts 30 minutes. Not fatal, just unforgettable. At the end, he's hauled out like a drenched rag, shivering and pale, covered in angry welts and slowly fattening leeches that are picked off one by a bored-looking apprentice with long wooden tongs. You glance away at that part. You've seen enough things squirm for one morning. Historians still argue whether the leech pool was actually widespread or a regional tradition exaggerated by visiting merchants and jealous scribes. Some suggest it was more symbolic, meant to terrify fraudsters without actually feeding them to worms. Others point out that keeping a leech pit going requires serious maintenance, and any society willing to put that kind of effort into a punishment probably used it more than once. You linger after the crowd departs, looking into the now settling pool. It's quiet again. Still, but you know what lurks under there now. Not just bloodsuckers, but consequence. You wonder if the man will return to his post, or if he'll be sent to labor camps or temple service, where he'll spend the rest of his years avoiding ponds and pulling weeds with gloved hands. A nearby boy throws a rock into the pool, and it plunks loudly. No movement. For now, further down the path, you find a small roadside shrine. A statue of Priya Norier stands there, one hand raised in blessing, the other holding a leech carved out of obsidian. Someone's left an offering of rice wrapped in palm leaf. Beside it, a slip of cloth with a charcoal drawing of a man being nibbled by worms. Art imitating life, Khmer style. You sit on a boulder nearby and breathe deeply. The sun's higher now, beating down on your shoulders. But the cool shade from the banyan tree behind you offers momentary peace. You close your eyes and hear the faint echo of dripping water, the murmured prayers of the guilty, the rustle of leaves trying not to think too hard about what they've witnessed. A frog croaks. You take that as your cue to leave. As you walk back to the city gates, a merchant waves and offers you a leech remedy made of turmeric, honey, and crushed chili. You decline, politely. Some things are best left to soak in silence. The next road you follow bends sharply through the merchant quarter and takes you toward the older temples, where the stone darkens and moss makes every statue look like it's growing a beard. Here, The air smells less like market spices and more like age-fermented stone, sun-warmed lichen, maybe a little regret. You pass a pair of novices sweeping leaves, and they whisper something about today's punishment being for the mouth. You're intrigued and mildly nervous. You keep walking until you reach a smaller courtyard off the path to Ta Prohm, one of those half-swallowed temples where roots coil like serpents over crumbling pillars. A priest stands beneath a jackfruit tree, fanning himself lazily while two guards pace beside a wooden bench. A woman sits there, wrists bound, head lowered. Her mouth is open, not from speaking but from fear. You realize with a jolt that her tongue is slightly protruding, already being held with a pair of sticks. A monk hums softly nearby, a melody that sounds more like a lullaby than something meant to precede mutilation. This is the punishment for liars. But not just any liars, dangerous liars, those who spread slander about nobles or fabricated accusations against monks. It's a serious offense in a world where harmony is law and truth is bound up in both spiritual and royal authority. Words have weight in the Khmer Empire, and when wielded carelessly, they're treated like weapons. So, the punishment? You guessed, eye removal of the weapon. Not always the whole tongue. That would be messy. But a part of it, usually the tip. Just enough to lisp for life, enough to mark you. Enough that every sentence you ever speak again carries the echo of your crime. Historians still argue whether these tongue removals were symbolic or surgical. Some sources describe hot knives and herbal anesthetics. Others say the procedure was deliberately crude, using animal sinew and sharpened bamboo. But all agree. The message was unmistakable. Your lies go no further than your teeth. The guards gently tilt the woman's head back. She doesn't fight. She's already confessed, apparently, to accusing a temple scribe of adultery when she knew full well he'd done no such thing. Her motives remain unclear. Revenge, jealousy, boredom, doesn't really matter now. What matters is that the court ruled against her, and now she's about to speak her last full sentence, the old-fashioned way. The priest steps forward, holding a small, flat knife. It looks more like a kitchen tool than an instrument of justice. He dips it in oil probably, some herbal mix meant to dull pain or prevent infection, and leans in. You can't watch, but you hear it. A sharp intake of breath. A single cry. And then, nothing. When you finally look again, it's done. The priest wraps her mouth in a clean cloth, murmurs a blessing, and nods to the guards. They lift her gently and walk her toward the shade, where a healer waits with a bowl of rice porridge and something steaming that smells like lemongrass and clove. For all the violence, there's a tenderness too. Khmer punishment was often cruel, but rarely careless. You remain seated for a while, staring at the empty bench. It's been scrubbed clean, as if erasing evidence could also erase memory. But it doesn't. Not really. A nearby monk turns toward you and says something unexpected. In some villages, they made the liars wear masks instead. You blink. Painted red, he continues, with no mouths. They wore them for a season. Couldn't speak, couldn't remove them. A gentler punishment maybe, but just as loud. You imagine that a world where the dishonest are silenced, not by knives, but by painted shame. A red face in a sea of unmasked honesty. It's oddly elegant, and no less terrifying. You thank the monk and continue your walk. Along the path, you pass a stone wall carved with hundreds of tiny dancers, each one frozen mid-movement. Their mouths are all closed. You wonder now if that was intentional. As you cross a wooden bridge toward the palace compound, a child runs past holding a woven masquerade, blank, expressionless. You don't ask where they got it. Some questions are better left unspoken. You pause near a pool and catch your reflection. Your lips, your tongue, still there. Still free to speak. But for the first time today, you're not sure what you'd even say. better to walk in silence. For now, by mid-afternoon, the sun hangs directly above Angkor Thom, like a judge's unblinking eye, casting no shadows, only truth. You move slowly through the outer halls of the palace, sticky with sweat and shadowed thought. You've seen crocodiles, elephants, leeches, even tongues surrendered to the silence of guilt, but now, something colder stirs beneath your sandals, a sound that's not sound, just the creak of wood and the hiss of heat meeting stone, the kind of silence that follows someone into exile. You've wandered into the exile compound. Not every Khmer punishment was visible or immediate. Some were long, drawn out, quiet. And this was one of those. Exile wasn't always dramatic banishment to a distant island. Often, it meant internal reassignment, sending someone to live out their days at the farthest reaches of the empire, stripped of status and far from familiar eyes. It was reserved for those too inconvenient to execute, but too dangerous to leave in place. Disgraced nobles, failed generals, monks who meddled in court politics, even members of the royal family who asked the wrong question at the wrong time. Today's exile is already in progress. A former astrologer, you overhear a palace advisor who apparently gave the wrong prediction about rainfall. Specifically, he declared there would be early monsoon blessings and a good rice harvest. Instead, a drought arrived. Crops failed, fingers pointed, and just like that, the stars turned on him. Historians still argue whether these exiles were scapegoats or genuine security risks. Khmer society didn't separate spiritual advice from political consequence. If your prophecy was wrong, it wasn't just an error, it was a disruption of cosmic harmony. And if the people no longer trusted your words, the empire no longer had use for your voice. The astrologer kneels on a mat made of dried banana stalks, his belongings packed in a bundle beside him, 3 books, a worn robe, and a jar of betel nuts. A guard ties a ceremonial red cord around his wrist knot to restrain, but to mark. The red cord signals exile. It's like wearing your shame in a bow. You watch quietly as he's handed a clay tablet with his destination etched into it, a remote village near the base of the Kulin Mountains, known for its feral pigs, its monks, and absolutely no tolerance for imperial drama. The priest conducting the exile reads from a scroll, not a punishment this time, but a sort of poetic farewell. A speech filled with metaphors about rivers forgetting their source and stars refusing to rise. You're not fluent in Old Khmer, but even you can tell it's pointed, elegant, but sharp. The astrologer doesn't cry. He simply bows 3 times, presses his forehead to the earth, and rises. He's offered a plain walking stick and an escort of 2 guards, more to ensure his departure than to protect him. He won't be imprisoned, just relocated and ignored. Exile was often a death of relevance more than body. Once you were gone, no one wrote your name. No one lit incense for your honor. You became a ghost in your own lifetime. That was the point. You follow the small procession to the edge of the city, where the jungle begins again, thick with vines and possibilities. A path curls away from the stone road, disappearing into the green. The astrologer steps onto it without hesitation, as if he saw this moment in the stars long ago and simply forgot to mention it. The guards follow, the leaves close behind them. And just like that, gone. You linger at the boundary, where a stone pillar marks the edge of official Angkor territory. It's carved with a single phrase, the silence beyond judgment. You sit by the pillar for a while, watching ants crawl over your sandals, wondering what it would feel like to vanish in plain sight, to be unspoken of, not hated, not forgiven, just erased. There's an older man nearby, squatting under a frangipani tree, smoking from a long bamboo pipe. He glances your way and says, "Exile's not death, but sometimes it's worse." You nod, not entirely sure if he's a philosopher or just a very eloquent gardener. He exhales a puff of smoke shaped like a question mark and adds, They used to exile poets too, if their verses were too sharp or too sad. You ask what happened to them. Some kept writing, he says, just on leaves. Then he laughs short. Bitterin turns his gaze back to the jungle. As you walk back into the city, you spot a scroll tucked into a crack in the temple wall. A single line written in charcoal. The moon sees all, but it doesn't speak. You don't take it, but you remember it. The next morning finds you pacing near the moat again, half expecting another crocodile performance, but the city feels hushed today, not quiet just, contained. You notice fewer merchants shouting, fewer monks chanting. Even the pigeons seem less opinionated. Then you hear it, a wooden rattle, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the shuffle of sandaled feet. You follow the sound, your steps landing soft as dust. It leads you through a corridor flanked with carved lions and weathered apsaras, and finally into a shadowed open space. There stands a row of bamboo cages, each no taller than a man's chest, and only wide enough for someone to crouch inside. A guard sits nearby, flipping a palm leaf fan, and looking as bored as someone surrounded by misery could possibly look. Inside one of the cages, a woman squats motionless, knees tucked under her chin, her back bowed. Her hands are tied, not tightly, but enough to make rest impossible. Around her neck is a sign, Disruptor of Monastic Peace. You don't know the full story, but the title paints a picture, something to do with shouting during a ritual, or maybe slapping a novice for bad rice. Whatever it was, it didn't earn her bloodshed. Just the slow, suffocating punishment, known simply as the cage of stillness. This wasn't about pain, it was about endurance. Khmer society prized discipline and order. To disrupt temple life, even in small ways, was to insult the sacred flow of the empire. Punishment, in this case, was not inflicted through whips or flame, but through time, posture, and the long grind of hours with no movement. Historians still argue whether cage punishment was meant primarily as rehabilitation or deterrent. Some say the offender was placed in the bamboo box for 3 days, allowed minimal food, water once daily, and one allowed word per evening. Others suggest the cages were sometimes lined with itching leaves or positioned near mosquito pools to intensify the misery. You don't see any leaves today, but the woman's skin is already covered in red spots, probably bites. Another cage stands beside here empty, but still warm from use. You ask a bystander what that one was for. Blasphemer, he mutters. Said the rain was late because the gods were lazy. You nod, eyebrows raised. That'll do it. A priest arrives and begins a short incantation list. A blessing, and more a verbal clock, marking time in verses. He walks in a circle around the cages, scattering marigold petals, and holding a censer shaped like a naga's head. The air turns thick with smoke and meaning. Then comes the ritual rattle, a long-handled wooden instrument with rotating beads that clack with each spin. It's passed along the line of cages every few hours, a sound that reminds both prisoners and public that stillness is not silence, it is discipline, it is consequence, and it is visible. A child tugs your sleeve and whispers, "They say if you twitch too many times, the spirits count it as lies." You don't know if that's true, but watching the woman in the cage, you realize she's barely moved since you arrived. Her eyes blink once. That's it. You step away, unsettled. Not because of gore, not because of spectacle, but because this punishment creeps into your own body. You find yourself stretching your back, wriggling your toes, rotating your shoulders, as if the stiffness might catch you by association. Further down the courtyard, an old man sits with a stack of charcoal sketches images of cage punishment scenes. Some are harsh, others oddly serene. One shows a monk voluntarily entering a cage as penance. Sometimes, the artist explains, they put themselves in to repent before being judged. You ask if people ever came out of the cage changed. Some did, he says. Others came out silent and never spoke again. You thank him and leave a coin on the mat. Walking back, you pass a bakery where sweet rice cakes steam in baskets. The scent is impossibly warm and inviting. You buy one and sit near the wall where the smoke from the incense barely reaches, and you eat. Slowly, bite by bite. It feels like an act of rebellion after watching someone denied comfort so thoroughly. Across the plaza, a rooster climbs a wall and crows loudly, defiantly. A guard throws a sandal at it and misses. You smile. It's the first time all day. As the sun slants lower, casting golden angles across the temple stones, you make your way to the edge of the compound. A bell rings. The guards begin rotating the prisoners, stretching one leg at a time, loosening the ropes just slightly before resetting them. Enough to prevent collapse, not enough to allow sleep. The woman's eyes meet yours for half a second. There's no hatred, no plea, just resignation, maybe even defiance, and then she looks away. You keep walking. As you pass a shaded wall, you notice a carving small and nearly hidden by moss. It shows a figure crouching in a box, surrounded by stars. Above it, a lotus blossom opening. You wonder, was the cage always a punishment? Or did someone once believe it could lead to awakening? You've barely shaken off the stiffness you felt from watching the caged woman when your feet carry you toward the edge of the artisan quarter, where the rhythms of punishment hum through the very bricks. Here, amid dye pots and broken stone molds, you catch wind of something off. Not a smell, a mood. The chatter is different, quieter, tenser, and it follows a single name repeated like a curse. Nang Sao. It means the cradle. You freeze. You've heard of this one before. The name alone has a lullaby softness that belies what it truly is. A punishment, not of fire or blade or shame, but of unnatural stillness wrapped in delicate cruelty. You follow the murmurs through alleys stacked with half-carved deities and silk banners drying in the sun, until you reach a small courtyard surrounded by apprentices, whispering to each other with wide eyes and clutched satchels. In the center is the device. It's beautiful, terrible, and absurdly simple. 2 thick bamboo poles suspended horizontally between 4 wooden stakes, creating a sort of elongated hammock. Except it doesn't sway. It doesn't comfort. Because resting inside it, trussed with ceremonial knots, is a man suspended just inches above the ground, folded in on himself like a leaf curling before the rain. His crime, you learn, was disrespecting the master carvera, revered artisan who shapes the faces of gods and kings. This man, an apprentice, had dared to mock his mentor's depiction of Vishnu's 4th arm, called it nudely, laughed in front of others. A small insult, yes, but in a culture where sacred art was literal devotion, this was blasphemy disguised as poor taste. So into the cradle he went. The cradle was used when the punishment had to sting without bleeding, reserved for spiritual offenses, artistic mockery, or ceremonial violations where the goal wasn't public spectacle, but deep internal correction. A spiritual timeout with physical consequences. He lies there now, his knees pressed tightly to his chest, his wrists and ankles bound in opposing directions so he cannot stretch without pain. The position is meant to mimic a fetus symbolizing rebirth, humility, and the undoing of arrogance. You watch a monk approach and sprinkle water onto his forehead with a single twig. A prayer floats out softly, like someone blowing dust off a forgotten book. The sun overhead shifts slightly, and you realize this apprentice has been in the cradle for hours already, maybe all day. His face is flushed, the corners of his mouth dry and twitching. Occasionally, a muscle spasms in his thigh, causing the whole contraption to wobble slightly, but he never cries out. He knows better. The cradle isn't meant to kill, but it leaves marks in the body, yes, and more importantly, on the ego. By the time the apprentice is released, his limbs will be stiff, his pride bent, and every movement will remind him of what it means to laugh at sacred things. Historians still argue whether the cradle originated from meditative postures or older agricultural devices. Some claim it was inspired by how rice baskets are tied shut for storage. Others say it began as a form of forest monk self-discipline, later repurposed by temple enforcers who liked the metaphor of wrapping someone back into submission. Nearby, a trio of sculptors carves quietly while the punishment unfolds. One of them nods at you and says, "He'll be better when he's out." Or he won't. You ask how long the punishment lasts. "Until the carving is finished," another replies, gesturing toward an unfinished statue of the god Indra. "When the fourth arm is complete, so is his penance." You stare at the god's half-formed limb, elegant, strong, and definitely not nudely. The artist finishes a single line with his chisel, and you hear the bound man inhale sharply. Whether it's pain or anticipation, you can't quite tell. You sit beside the elder sculptor for a while, watching chips of stone fall like pale snow onto the flagstones. He tells you that once, long ago, a prince was bound in the cradle for mocking the design of his own father's shrine. He emerged, changed, the old man says, and went on to fund the temple of 1,000 Buddhas. What happened to his sense of humor, you ask? The old man shrugs. Still curled up, I think, somewhere in his knees. You watch the apprentice again. His eyes are closed now, his breath slow, as if trying to disappear inside himself. You wonder what you'd say if bound like that, who you'd become on the other side. What thoughts might haunt you when your body is folded so small that there's nowhere to store arrogance? As the sun dips lower and the stone cools, you rise and walk past the shrine one more time. The god's fourth arm is nearly done. So is the punishment. But the lesson, that lingers. You're beginning to realize something unsettling. There's a rhythm to these punishments, a tempo beneath the city's heartbeat. One moment it's all fire and spectacle. The next it's quiet introspection locked inside bamboo. And now it's sound, deafening, rhythmic, and very, very deliberate. You find the source near the musician's courtyard, just past where the dancers rehearse for temple ceremonies. There's a stage, but today it's not for dancing. No silk, no cymbals, just a single man standing barefoot at its center, arms tied above his head to a wooden frame. Behind him stands a drummer, eyes cold, drum massive, hands poised. A punishment performance is about to begin. This is the drum of reprimand. Unlike punishments that leave scars, this one leaves memory loud, unavoidable, and echoing across the minds of everyone who hears it. It was reserved for those who disrespected royal rituals, particularly performers who disrupted sacred music or priests who fell asleep during festivals. The man before you? He's a palace musician who apparently struck a wrong note during the procession of Vishvakarma. Not once, but repeatedly, and with enough volume that the high priest paused mid-prayer to glare at the sky as if the gods themselves had just hiccuped. You join the circle of onlookers. Most are quiet. A few fellow musicians maybe stand with arms folded and tight mouths. They know the cost of discord in a city that believes divine order is kept not just with laws but with harmonies. In the Khmer Empire, sound wasn't entertainment, it was ceremony, magic, memory. To violate it was to rupture the sacred. A senior priest approaches the bound man and recites a list of misplayed notes, each one named like a crime. Then he nods to the drummer, who lifts his hands and begins. The rhythm is slow at first. Boom, boom, boom. With each strike, the man flinches. The drum is enormous, and the vibrations hit harder than any fist, not because of physical impact, these not being struck, but because of what the drum represents. Shame, mistake, imperfection, broadcast for all to hear. And then the pace quickens. Boom, boom, boom. The sound seems to wrap around your ribs, crawl into your ears. It's not just noise. It's judgment in sonic form. The drummer doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Each beat says, "You failed. You broke the flow. You were off key when the world demanded precision." The bound man begins to tremble. Not from pain, from embarrassment, humiliation. The kind that soaks into skin and echoes for weeks. A child near you covers their ears. A few others giggle nervously, but no one dares speak. To interrupt this punishment would be to invite your own rhythm of reprimand, and nobody wants to dance to that tune. Historians still argue whether this ritual was rooted in ancient healing or pure social discipline. Some believe the drum's vibration was thought to recalibrate the offender's inner meter, resetting their spirit to match the cosmic beat. Others claim it was just a cleverly loud form of public shaming. No blood, no bruises, just noise and the echo of failure. The performance lasts 12 minutes, a sacred number. 1 minute for each hour of daylight, each a reminder of order, cycle, responsibility. At the end, the drummer stops mid-beat. Silence falls like a blade. The priest steps forward again and touches the man's shoulder gently, a symbolic gesture acknowledgement of error and release. The ropes are untied. The man stumbles, but doesn't fall. Instead, he kneels and presses his head to the stage. The crowd parts silently as he walks off, head bowed, hands trembling like leaves. You remain a little longer. The drum stands still now, but in your chest you still feel its echo. Nearby, a younger apprentice turns to his teacher and asks softly, "Will they let him play again?" "Of course," the teacher says. "That's the point." Because in Khmer justice, some punishments didn't end careers, they tuned them. You weren't discarded, you were recalibrated. Later, you visit a small shrine dedicated to Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and music. There, someone has left a miniature drum carved from sandalwood, inscribed with the phrase, "Strike with rhythm, not rage." You smile at that. It feels right. Gentle. Honest. You wander through the dancers' hallway next. They're practicing without music today, barefoot on the stone, fingers flowing like reeds in a river. The instructor counts aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. You pause. The rhythm feels familiar. And then you realize it matches the punishment drum. A reminder, a lesson, embedded into the daily steps of those who live by movement and sound. You walk on with quieter feet, more aware now of your own rhythm, one that you hope never skips a beat. You're lulled into a soft rhythm after the drum, your feet matching the beat, your breath slower, your thoughts still rattling gently like sticks in a prayer rattle. But Khmer punishments don't stay predictable for long. As the sun tips toward late afternoon, you pass a stretch of temple walls where carved nagas coil around the gates, their stone mouths hissing silently into the breeze. And beyond those gates, something strange unfolds. It's not a punishment of blood or sound. It's one of stillness and discomfort, a ceremony, involving no ropes, no drums, no fire, just a stone seat baked by the sun, and the slow creep of hours. This one's called the Throne of Arrogance. You slip inside the open plaza, your sandals brushing over dry grass, and find the condemned seated atop an exposed stone platform, smooth, flat, and absolutely scalding. The seat has no shade, no back, and no reprieve. Just him, the sun, and the full weight of imperial disapproval. His posture is stiff, legs crossed awkwardly, palms upturned in forced meditation. A sign sits in front of the platform, painted in red script. Mocked the venerable sage during discourse. Oof. Apparently, this man, an overly ambitious scholar, had publicly corrected a senior monk during a philosophical debate, loudly, smugly, and, worst of all, incorrectly. Not only was he wrong, He was gleefully wrong in front of an audience of high-ranking clergy and court nobles. A poor combination of arrogance and bad timing. So, onto the hot seat he went. Literally, the throne of arrogance was designed for offenses of the mind rather than the flesh. It wasn't about pain in the conventional sense. It was about exposure. The sun beat down relentlessly, not just on the skin, but on the ego. There was no covering, no distraction, only forced contemplation under blistering sky. And if you moved, you started over. If you cried out, the time doubled. If you fainted, they'd revive you, and back on the seat you'd go. Historians still argue whether this punishment was imported from India or an indigenous invention of the Angkor court. Some say it mimicked yogic poses, meant to force humility through enforced reflection. Others think it was a particularly Khmer twist on public shaming, where instead of parading you through the streets, they made you sit still until your own thoughts turned against you. A nearby monk explains that the length of the punishment is decided by the gravity of the arrogance. In this case, the scholar must endure 1 hour for each of the elder monk's decades in service. That's 73 minutes. 73 sizzling, awkward, increasingly itchy minutes. A guard leans on a parasol nearby, not for the prisoner, of course, but for himself, and checks a water clock made of coconut shells. When the last drop slips through, he'll ring a bell, not to end the punishment, but to begin the cool-down period. Yes, because in typical Khmer fashion, you didn't get up right away. That would be undignified. Instead, you were expected to sit for an additional 10 minutes, motionless, as a gesture of repentance, the silent encore. You watch as the seated man squints against the sun. His lips move in a whisper, maybe reciting prayers, maybe just begging his buttocks not to blister. Either way, he doesn't shift. He's determined not to fail again. To your left, a pair of young scribes sketch him onto parchment, using smooth strokes of ochre ink. Their teacher supervises, pointing at the subtle curve of the man's spine, the way the heat distorts the air around his shoulders. This drawing will be added to the Scroll of Fools, a record kept in the monastic library of those who let pride outweigh wisdom. A kind of greatest hits collection, except the songs are sweaty men learning the hard way that sarcasm has consequences. A priest passes you a small scroll, and you unroll it curiously. It reads, "The tongue cuts, but the seat burns longer." You fold it back up, unsure if that's meant to be comforting. Eventually, the bell rings. A breeze stirs the dust. The man on the stone doesn't move. The crowd remains respectfully silent during the final 10 minutes. No clapping, no commentary. Just the sound of distant birds and the slow drip of ceremonial water into a bronze basin. When the final moment passes, 2 attendants step forward and gently lift the man under his arms. He doesn't resist, but his legs wobble like softened wax. They guide him to a shaded bench and hand him a cup of cool tamarind water. He drinks slowly, carefully, eyes still closed. You can't help but admire his restraint. Nearby, a young acolyte mutters, "I heard the sage he insulted once sat on that same seat himself, voluntarily, for discipline." You blink. Why? The boy shrugs. He'd let his voice rise during a funeral. Regretted it. Spent 2 hours on the stone to remind himself not to rush sorrow. That stays with you. You glance at the seat again. Empty now, but not silent. The stone still glows faintly with heat, and you swear it hums. If you get close, like it's absorbed centuries of pride and forced them to sit still until they learned better. You walk away slowly, passing a carved pillar etched with a single line. "Those who rise too quickly fall into fire." Wise words. And you take shorter steps for the rest of the day. The sun begins its slow descent over Angkor, dipping the city into honeyed gold, and you wander westward through a narrow lane where the walls are close and the shadows even closer. You're not entirely sure where you're heading until you see the smoke-soft, gray wisps curling into the air like lazy thoughts, not thick enough to be dangerous, just enough to smell like wood, resin, and something faintly acrid. You follow it past a cluster of food stalls, where even the vendors have fallen quiet, their eyes fixed in one direction. A guard waves you through, and now you're inside a small square where the punishment circle is drawn with red chalk, not for ceremony, but for control. You immediately notice the focal point. A man kneeling on a wooden mat, his feet bare, his hands gripping two thin reeds tightly across his knees. Before him, a smoldering brazier. This is the incense reckoning. A spiritual punishment, this one. Quiet, symbolic, and suffocating in its own strange way. The man isn't being beaten or caged or baked. He's being purified through breath, endurance, and scent. Apparently, he's a low-ranking temple scribe who committed a subtle but serious transgression, forging a minor religious document. Not a forgery for wealth or power, just laziness. He copied a blessing chant incorrectly, omitted a line, and tried to hide it by tracing over the old script. But someone noticed. They always do. In Khmer tradition, errors in spiritual writing weren't simple mistakes. They were stains on the collective karmic cloth. A misspelled mantra could ripple through the empire like a bad wind, and those who handled words had a sacred responsibility to guard their integrity. So his punishment? Breathe the truth back in. A monk circles him now, carrying a bundle of incense, sticks 7 in total, each soaked in a different blend of herbs and oils, meant to trigger memory, heat, and reflection. Cinnamon, turmeric, benzoin, sandalwood, tamarind bark, dried jasmine, and of course own stick soaked in chili oil. Not for the nose, but for the lesson. The monk plants the sticks around the kneeling man in a wide circle, then lights them one by one. As they begin to burn, the air thickens. The man must remain still, breathing deeply, reciting the correct chant he had once ruined. 1 verse per breath. If he stumbles, the cycle starts again. Historians still argue whether this form of punishment was meditative correction or slow-motion torture. On the surface, it looks peaceful, controlled, but the heat from the burning incense, the sting of the chili smoke, the mental strain of repetition, it all adds up to something far more intense than it seems. A nearby novice leans in and whispers, "The jasmine's supposed to help him remember purity. The chili is for shame." You nod slowly. The scents are starting to reach you, too cloying sweetness mixed with something sharp that prickles your sinuses. You step back. The man doesn't move. His face is damp, his eyes closed, his lips mumbling softly. You try to make out the words, probably one of the creation hymns, but the syllables blend together like steam. A breeze stirs the smoke, wafting it sideways. The man inhales it all. The final stick burns closest, the chili. You see it hit him. A full body flinch, but he holds his posture. His eyes open, red now. He gasps. Not a word, just a sound. But the monk doesn't stop the ceremony. This is part of it. He must breathe his way through shame, 1 breath at a time. A gong sounds softly in the background, marking the end of a cycle. The man finishes the verse, barely, then slumps forward just enough to show the edge of fatigue without inviting correction. The monk walks over and touches his shoulder. A signal. He's done. Attendants bring him a cloth soaked in cold lemongrass water. He presses it to his face, inhaling clean air for the first time in over an hour. He says nothing, doesn't need to. His voice has carried the punishment. His lungs were the vessel, and the temple has heard him. You find a shaded bench and sit, still catching the tail end of the jasmine smoke drifting in spirals through the courtyard. You're struck by how gentle this punishment seemed, but how effective. It reached into the body without ever breaking it. The Khmer knew that not every correction needed steel. A scribe passes you, carrying a fresh stack of blank palm leaf manuscripts. He nods at the space where the punished man once knelt. He'll copy all 7 chants again tonight, from memory. You ask what happens if he gets them wrong. The scribe shrugs, then he breathes again. You stand and stretch, bones quietly popping, and make your way toward the temple gates. A child sells sweet tamarind paste near the exit and offers you a sample. You take it. It tastes oddly like the smoke sharp, sweet, and oddly humbling. You don't say much for the rest of the evening. Sometimes the best corrections are the ones you carry home in your breath. It's just after nightfall now, and for the first time today, you think maybe the punishments are done. The air's cooler, the cicadas have taken up their nightly opera, and even the guards look less serious, chatting softly over bowls of sticky rice. But Khmer justice doesn't punch a time clock. You round a temple corner and hear something unsettling, the faint creak of rope under tension, and a rhythmic, wet slap against stone. You move toward the sound and spot flickering torchlight ahead. Another punishment is underway. This one grim, even by today's standards, is called the hanging balance. You see the man before you, long before you understand him. He hangs suspended by the arms, not high, just a foot off the ground. His hands are bound to a wooden yoke stretched horizontally, while his ankles are tied together below. A clay pot is suspended from each foot, simple jars filled with water, tied with woven reed rope. They sway gently, sloshing with each tremble of his legs. And tremble they do. He's not screaming. That would be too easy. He's breathing hard through gritted teeth, sweat slicking his shoulders in the firelight. Every shake of his muscles sends another wave of liquid shifting in the pots, forcing him to correct, to balance, to endure. This punishment isn't about torture. It's about judgment in motion. The man had been accused of selling diluted palm wine to monks, an offense that insulted both body and spirit. You don't just cheat the customer here, you cheat the cosmos. If you water down what's meant to be sacred, you lose your right to stand easily on the earth. So now he hangs, every tendon in his legs and shoulders screaming silently to keep the jars from tipping. If they fall, he starts again. If they break, the next ones are heavier. Historians still argue whether this technique came from martial training or spiritual practice. Some say it began as a warrior's balance test and was co-opted by priests who saw potential in its metaphor. Keep your offerings honest, or lose your footing altogether. Others believe it originated with harvest festivals, where workers balanced jars to prove their steadiness before being allowed to handle ceremonial goods. But somewhere along the line, it became punishment. A monk sits nearby with a notched stick. Each notch marks a successful minute. He carves it slowly, methodically, the rhythm nearly matching the drip-drip of sweat falling from the man's chin. You sit on a stone ledge, watching the scene unfold in torchlight shadows. The quiet is oppressive, just the occasional grunt, the creak of rope, the gurgle of displaced water, and every so often the man mutters a prayer through clenched teeth. Not to be released, just to last one more minute. A guard whispers, "He's on his second attempt." You blink. He dropped them? The guard nods. 14 minutes in, one jar cracked. He started over. You ask how long he must last. 33, the guard says. One for each temple he sold to. You wince. That's a long time to pretend your knees aren't made of paper. But he holds. Somehow. One foot shifts and corrects, then the other. It's like watching a dancer trapped mid-pose. No music. Just the rhythm of pain and gravity, and the truth sloshing beneath him. And the jars stay level. A fringe detail catches your eye. There's a series of small clay tiles laid along the wall nearby, each marked with names. You wander over and realize they're past offenders who completed the balance. Their punishment earned them a strange kind of honor. Not erased, not shunned, just marked. Their names preserved. not as villains, not as martyrs, as lessons. You trace your fingers over one inscription that reads, "He who deluded now holds steady." It gives you chills, and not just from the night air. Behind you, the final notch is carved into the stick. The monk nods, and two attendants move forward. They lift the jars first gently, like sacred offerings, then untie the man's arms, catching him before he falls. He sags like wet cloth, eyes half-lidded, too exhausted to even groan. He's carried to a bench and offered warm rice water. One sip. That's it. Enough to remind him what true honesty tastes like. You don't follow them. You just watch the swinging rope settle, then wander off toward the lantern-lit causeway that leads back to the heart of Angkor Thom. As you pass a shrine nestled beneath a Bodhi tree, you notice a monk placing two empty jars at the base. No explanation. Just the vessels. Still. Unbroken. Waiting. You pause and wonder how many more people will be asked to hang by their lives before sunrise, and whether any of them will last 33 minutes. The moon is high now, hanging over Angkor Thom, like a watchful eye that refuses to blink. You walk slowly through the palace gardens, where even the lotus flowers seem to sleep. It would be peaceful, if not for the low chanting you hear drifting from the southern cloister, the kind of chant that smells faintly of wet clay and regret. You follow it because of course you do. At this point, curiosity is your cruelest habit. You pass beneath a carved lintel depicting a celestial battle and emerge into a smaller courtyard lit by 4 braziers. A group of monks stands in a circle, heads bowed, voices layered in perfect drone. And at the center of the circle, kneeling on a cushion of woven reed, hands clasped, wearing a heavy mask made of lacquered wood, is the accused. This is the mask of false enlightenment. At first, it doesn't look like much. A theatrical face, serene and calm, painted with gold leaf eyebrows and a gentle, everlasting smile. But the man inside it is shaking. His breathing rasps through the nostril holes. His robes are damp with sweat, and when he shifts even slightly, you hear the jingle of a chain that runs from the mask's base to a stake in the floor. He's not going anywhere. He's a monk, or at least, he was. Now he's being punished for performing unauthorized visions, claiming to have seen spirits and ancestors in places where none had appeared. He told villagers their dead relatives were waiting just beyond the temple gates, asking for offerings, blessings, even coin. It stirred up panic. A few families gave away all their grain. One mother refused to eat until her son's ghost was satisfied. It was a lie, or delusion, or both. And now he wears the smile of someone who pretended to be closer to the gods than he truly was. The mask is not just symbolism, it's a ritual object. Its interior is lined with dense herbs and heated stones. Inside, it grows hotter with every breath. The longer you wear it, the more it presses your false serenity against your real discomfort. Historians still argue whether the mask originated as a performer's tool or a punishment artifact. Some believe it was once used in temple dances and was repurposed by senior monks after a scandal involving a delusional initiate. Others argue the mask was crafted explicitly for this task, a sculpted warning to those who dare falsify the sacred. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. The man kneels for hours, wearing the face of peace while his body simmers beneath it. Each time the monks complete a chant cycle, they step forward and whisper a verse into the mask's mouth, reminders of humility, of service, of the line between devotion and delusion. He's not allowed to respond, not allowed to move, just listen, absorb, sweat. The ceremony goes on. You sit quietly beside a pillar etched with Sanskrit poetry. One line reads, "The gods do not shout, only liars must." It fits. Across from you, a younger monk catches your eye and whispers, "They say he actually believes he saw something." You glance back at the masked man. Did he? "No one knows," the monk says. That's the danger. Its truesome offenses were obvious: theft, violence, fraud. But spiritual falsehood? That lived in the gray. The slippery world, where faith and fear share the same face. So the mask becomes the test. If you're lying, it unmasks you from the inside. If you're deluded, it's a mirror. If you're truly touched by divinity, well, you'll survive the heat. As the night stretches on, the brazier flames sink lower, casting shadows that make the mask's smile look grotesque. Still, the man kneels. He hasn't collapsed. Not yet, but his hands tremble, his shoulders sag, and a faint burn mark is visible just beneath his collar where the mask's edge has rubbed skin raw. Eventually, a senior monk rings a small bell 3 times. That's the signal. 2 acolytes approach and unfasten the chain, then gently lift the mask free. The man inside doesn't move. He blinks slowly, eyes glassy with heat and salt. He whispers a single word you don't understand, then bows deeply once, twice, 3 times. He's helped to his feet and led to a shadowed corner where a low table waits. Water, herb paste, a cloth. He's left alone to contemplate. Whether he found truth inside the mask or not is between him and whatever gods might still be listening. You watch as a younger monk steps forward to clean the mask. He does it tenderly, wiping down the inside, polishing the gold mouth. Then he returns it to a lacquered box, carved with a single symbol, a closed eye. You step back into the courtyard, and something occurs to you. How many wore that mask before him? And how many believed the lie, even as they drowned in its heat? The monks begin chanting again, not for punishment this time, but for balance, for stillness, for the line between knowing and pretending. You pass a sleeping cat curled beside a stone Buddha and wonder if enlightenment ever really comes quietly, or if it arrives disguised in sweat, heat, and the forced smile of a mask meant to unmake you. The moon slips westward now, trailing silver ribbons over the rooftops of Angkor, and the city exhales in low, rhythmic gusts. Most have retired for the night, gardeners curled on reed mats, priests tucked under incense-warmed eaves, but not you. Your path drifts beyond the outer sanctuaries now, into the torch-lit training grounds just beyond the Temple of the Elephants. Here, punishment takes a different form. It doesn't hum, it sweats. You step onto the sandy grounds and immediately feel the shift. The air heavier, the torches burning lower, the silence broken only by the dull thump of fists meeting wood. You spot him right away, young, shirtless, streaked with sweat and grime, kneeling before a tall wooden pole polished to a shine by generations of knuckles. This is the pole of correction. A military punishment, brutal in its simplicity, relentless in its message. It's not meant to wound, but to grind away arrogance, disobedience, or what they call martial sloppiness. The young man, barely older than a rice farmerese, a palace guard in training, who reportedly abandoned his post to sneak fermented coconut wine from a storage hut. It wasn't just desertion, it was indulgence, a cardinal sin for those trusted with royal defense. Now he kneels here, fists closed, back straight, waiting for the whistle that begins the rite. It's not torture, not technically. He isn't beaten. Instead, he is ordered to strike the wooden pole exactly 100 times. No miss. No pause. Each punch must land clean, center, and strong. And each must come with a breath, a chant, and a bow. The punishment is physical, poetry rhythmic, repetitive, symbolic. A veteran instructor stands nearby with a length of black bamboo in his hands, not for violence, but for rhythm. He taps the pole gently between strikes, establishing pace. Too slow? You start over. Too soft? You add 10. Too emotional? You begin again, this time blindfolded. And yes, they'll do that. Historians still argue whether this ritual was inspired by Indian martial traditions or developed natively among Khmer temple guards. Some claim it mimicked combat training. Others say it stemmed from an old farmer's ritual where men would strike posts to test the wood before building homes, symbolizing readiness, endurance, and purity of purpose. Somehow, over centuries, it morphed into penance. The whistle blows. The young guard rises slightly, steadies himself, and punches. Thump. Again. Thump. Each blow is punctuated by a whispered line. I serve. I protect. I remain. You think he might not last 10, but then you notice something curious. He's not flinching. He's breathing into it-coiling power not from rage, but from rhythm. His instructor watches him with a cold, hawk-like gaze. No praise. Just a nod when needed. Discipline without affection. Somewhere around punch 20, his knuckles split. You see it, just a thread of red. But he doesn't stop. He switches to the second knuckle line, adjusting his stance, breathing deeper. A small crowd of silent soldiers gathers. No one speaks. This isn't entertainment. It's memory in the making. He reaches 50, then 60, then 70. His arms shake. Sweat falls like rain. His chants get softer, but still every strike lands true. You can't help but feel something primal. This isn't cruelty anymore. It's transformation. The kind of raw physical humbling that can't be faked. A young soldier beside you whispers, if he finishes clean, he'll be honored with double duty. You blink. Double duty's a reward? The soldier shrugs. Better than starting over. By strike 90, his fists are nearly useless. He shifts again, now using the bottom of his palm. It's not as clean, but it keeps the rhythm. The instructor watches closely, one brow arched, judging whether it counts. The bamboo rod taps faster. The last 10 hits blur. 929. 100. Then, silence. The guard collapses to his knees, palms open like cracked clay bowls, chest heaving. The instructor steps forward, nods once, and marks the boy's name on a wooden slate hanging from a pole nearby. No title, no insult, just a name, and beside it, a circle. Meaning, completed. He's not congratulated, not clapped on the back. But when the other soldiers help him to his feet and guide him toward the healing tent, they do so with respect, quiet, earned, and complete. You stay behind a moment, walking to the pole. Up close, it's warm, scarred, sticky. You reach out, tap it with your fingers. It feels like a monument not of pain, but of perseverance. A plaque beside the base reads, "He who disciplines himself spares others the need." You walk back through the courtyard under a quiet moon, past soldiers now returning to their posts, sandals crunching softly over gravel, hands resting lightly on spear shafts. The scent of healing salves drifts through the air, ginger, camphor, lemongrass. You pass the infirmary and see the young man again, wrapped in cloth, sipping rice porridge from a bowl. He glances up. Your eyes meet. He doesn't look ashamed. He looks ready. There's something strange about the stillness that follows martial punishment. The kind of quiet that settles not in the air, but under your skin. Even as you leave the training grounds, torchlight dancing behind you like a fading fever dream, your breath comes a little slower, your own posture straighter, as if witnessing discipline sharpens your own edges. But Khmer law isn't done molding you yet. Your feet carry you toward the Western Canal, where the trees hang low and the water reflects every lantern like a flickering ghost. It's there that you find tonight's final judgmenta punishment, known simply and ominously as the trial by still water. At first, it looks ceremonial. A platform floats on the surface of the canal, 4 logs lashed together, painted in sacred ochre, just big enough for a person to sit cross-legged. And on that platform is a woman, hair bound, eyes downcast, arms resting gently on her knees. From a distance, she could be meditating, peaceful, centered. But when you get closer, you see the tension, her jaw clenched, her fingers trembling slightly, and the rope. A thin silken cord runs from her left ankle to the boat moored nearby, a line held loosely by an attendant monk. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder. If she falls, she does not swim. She is pulled, fast, cold, and painfully embarrassed. The punishment is for dishonest mediation and offense, deeply frowned upon in a society where temple officials often helped settle disputes. She had served as a mediator between two rival farming families arguing over flood irrigation rights. And according to temple records, she'd quietly accepted a basket of rare dried fish in exchange for leaning her interpretation toward one family's favor. Not quite bribery, but not quite justice either. So now she sits on the water, the literal middle ground. The trial by still water is one of the oldest forms of Khmer correction part punishment, part test. It's not meant to physically harm, though it's certainly uncomfortable. It's about poise under truth. The platform, barely larger than a dining mat, shifts with every breeze. Your job is to remain seated, cross-legged, perfectly balanced. For hours. No food, no anchor, just you, and the steady ripple of your own guilt. Historians still argue whether this trial evolved from older river rites or Buddhist meditation practices. Some claim it was originally a priestly rite of passage, later twisted into punishment. Others suggest it came from fisherman culture, where those who disrespected water gods were forced to consult the stillness until they repented. Either way, the result is the same. You face the mirror of yourself, and the canal decides if you blink. She's already been out there 2 hours. A small crowd lines the banks, quiet, respectful. This isn't public spectacle. It's more like a village vigil. Many here likely know her. A few might even have trusted her in previous disputes. But no one shouts. No one mocks. They simply watch, because the lesson is for them, too. You ask a nearby boy how long she must remain. He shrugs. Until the moon reaches the dragon star. You glance up. The constellation's still a few hand lengths away from where it needs to be. Probably another hour. Maybe more, if the clouds cooperate. The water laps softly. A frog croaks once. She blinks. Barely. A priest steps forward with a lantern and gently places it at the far edge of the platform. A final trial. She must stand, lift the lantern without tipping the platform, and set it back behind her. A task that sounds simple until you realize she's spent 2 hours becoming part of the stillness. Any motion now risks throwing it all off. She breathes. You can see her core tighten, her hands brace, her focus narrow like the edge of a blade. Slowly, ever so slowly, she shifts forward, rising on shaking knees. The platform wobbles. Someone in the crowd gasps. She steadies herself. 1 foot forward, then another. She reaches the lantern, lifts it. The flame flickers but holds. She turns, steps back, and sets it down. The crowd exhales as one. The monk at the rope lifts his hand a signal. Her punishment is complete. You think there will be cheers, or at least soft clapping. But there's just silence. A quiet nod of shared understanding. The monk pulls her raft to the edge, and 2 attendants help her onto the bank. She kneels, bows once to the canal, once to the crowd, and once to herself. Then she leaves. No words, no chains. Just waterlogged humility. You sit by the edge after she's gone, staring into the canal. You see your own reflection ripple gently, flicker with each insect's brush against the surface, and you wonder what would your platform feel like. Would you last an hour? Would the lantern stay upright? Khmer justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers across the water, and the hardest part is listening. The banks of the canal slip behind you as you tread deeper into the labyrinthine arteries of the city. Angkor at night is never quite silent it breathes. You hear the flapping of night birds, the murmur of water jars being refilled, and occasionally the hollow clack of bamboo wind chimes brushing in temple doorways. But as you pass under the arched gate of the judicial compound where disputes were once judged and punishments assigned you, catch a different sound entirely, the rhythmic flick of paper and a very deliberate cough. You've entered the domain of the scribal court, and tonight it seems one unlucky soul has been called to endure the red ink reckoning. You push open a cedar door worn smooth by countless hands and step inside. The room is narrow but grand, the ceiling high, the walls lined with scrolls in meticulous bundles tied with string. Incense burns in fat clay bowls, and oil lamps flicker beside towering bamboo pens that stand like sentinels. And there, at a low desk near the center, sits the accused cross-legged, stiff, and trembling slightly as he prepares to copy a decree by hand. He's not bound, not beaten, but he might wish he were. This man was once a junior record keeper in the king's tax court. His crime? Transcription tampering. He altered a date on a village levy scroll just a single character, mind you, which made it appear that a fine had been imposed in error, a seemingly tiny shift, but that mark shaved 2 weeks off the deadline for payment. The result? The village missed it, the collection guards arrived, and 6 families lost their cattle. Here, in Angkor, a single scribal stroke can carry more weight than a sword. And so, he's being punished, not with silence, but with correction. The monk overseeing the punishment unrolls the scroll to be copied. It's a legal decree twice the length of a sugarcane stalk, with the text printed in both Sanskrit and Old Khmer. Every syllable is sacred. Every line must be exact. But instead of black ink, he must use red. Red, the color of error, the color of failure, the color used only to correct mistakes in training halls or to mark passages that required spiritual penance. To write an entire decree in red is to visually confess with each word, I am wrong. And to make it more maddening, he must do it all by torchlight. Historians still argue whether this punishment was spiritual or bureaucratic in origin. Some believe it was tied to ancient Hindu rituals where red was used to purify corrupted texts. Others think it was purely pragmatic. Make the offender live inside the offense, letter by letter, until they understood how even the smallest ink stroke could shake an empire. You watch as he dips the bamboo quill twice, carefully, and drags the first syllable across the palm leaf paper. It's beautiful, clean, precise. This is no amateur, which is exactly what makes the punishment worse. The more skilled the scribe, the more devastating the humiliation. A novice would scratch it out in agony. But he must perform his own condemnation with grace. Halfway down the first column, he stumbles. A pause. A tremble. He scratches the back of his hand anxiously. The monk notices and reaches for the water clock. If he doesn't complete the scroll within the set period tonight, before the final torch burns out must begin again. And the next time, it will be on raw palm fiber, not prepared parchment. His lips move silently, perhaps reciting from memory, perhaps praying. He resumes. Each line is an act of self-repair. Each character a stitch in the unraveling robe of his reputation. You glance around the room. Other scrolls here are sealed in wax, marked with red stamps of the royal lion. These are final records, never to be altered. But the scribal punishment scroll, that one gets stored too. Not for reference, for reminder. At the end of the punishment, the red scroll will be placed in a side hall nicknamed the Wall of Regretta, narrow chamber, where errant documents are shelved spine outward so the names of their authors remain visible. No citizen is allowed to copy them. No one may cite their content. They exist as silent ghosts. A paper purgatory. He finishes line 14. Then 15. His hand cramps. You can see it's subtle, but sharp. He pauses only to crack his knuckles and adjust his posture before diving back in. There's something admirable about it, the way he doesn't cry or complain or curse the gods. He just keeps writing, like someone rowing against the current of their own mistake. You look down and realize your feet have been tracing the grooves in the stone beneath the desk gears of scribes doing just this, kneeling in the exact same agony, trying to earn their way back from the edge. A soft gong sounds. The monk rises and approaches the scribe, who's just completed the final line. His fingers shake as he lays the pen aside and bows, forehead touching the parchment. Not in triumph, in acknowledgement. The monk examines the scroll. He nods. No errors. He stamps the bottom corner with a carved red lotus, then gently picks up the scroll and carries it down the hall to the room you now know holds the regrets of the literate damned. The scribe remains behind, hands open in his lap. You want to say something, but what's there to offer? So instead, you glance at the scroll he copied from. It's already being re-rolled and sealed. Next week, someone else will read it aloud in court, never knowing that one man had to relive it syllable by syllable to atone for a flick of ink. As you leave the court and return to the street, you look down at your hands. They feel lighter somehow, or maybe just more careful. You wander now through one of the quieter quarters of Angkor, past sleeping merchants and curled-up cats, into a walled garden where the air smells of crushed lemongrass and memory. You think maybe the punishments are done for the night, that your eyes have seen the last confession, the last kneeling figure. But the Khmer Empire, you've come to understand, doesn't run out of ways to demand correction. You hear the sound before you see a dull, rhythmic clack, 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 like wood knocking against bone. You follow it past a hedge of night-blooming jasmine, into a clearing lit with only one torch and the soft flicker of a bowl of oil. In its center stands an enormous stone wheellight feet across, carved with glyphs, each segment painted in bright ceremonial pigment. Around it, a rope and pulley system connects the wheel to a bench where a figure is seated, ankles and wrists loosely bound in a meditative pose. Welcome to the wheel of repetition. This isn't a wheel for breaking bones or grinding grain. It's a mnemonic device turned punitive engine. The man strapped to the bench is not in physical agony yet, but he's under pressure all the same. His crime? He misspoke. And not in the casual, stumble-through-a-sentence way. This was deliberate. He misquoted a sacred teaching to elevate his own position in a temple debate, changed a few words, twisted a line of wisdom just enough to make himself sound more learned than he really was. And now the wheel spins, one slow revolution at a time, and with each click, he must speak the corrected phrase out loud. Again, and again, and again. One click per phrase. Dozens of phrases per revolution. 7 revolutions. Before he's unbound. Historians still argue whether this device was based on a Buddhist prayer wheel or an indigenous Khmer invention. Some claim it was first used to help monks memorize complex sermons. Others insist it was originally a training tool for court messengers who had to recall decrees perfectly. But somewhere along the line, it became a quiet, echoing punishment chamber. You sit on a low bench, carved with elephant tusks, and listen. Truth repeats itself. A lie must always reinvent. Click. Humility begins when the tongue slows. Click. Let the words pass through you, not from you. Click. Each phrase spoken calmly. Then again. Then again. The man's voice stays steady at first. But by the 3rd revolution, it starts to strain. His throat dries. His cadence wavers. But the wheel, it doesn't care. Click. Truth repeats itself. Click. A lie must always reinvent. The crowd is smaller here. 2 monks keeping watch. one scribe noting each line on a parchment to ensure consistency. You ask softly, what happens if he misquotes again? The elder monk doesn't even look up. He begins anew. You glance at the wheel. Its glyphs represent stages of speech: silence, intention, breath, utterance, consequence, memory, echo, silence again. A full circle of communication. Punishment designed not to destroy, but to restore rhythm. By the fifth revolution, the man's voice cracks. His head droops. A novice steps forward with a ladle of tamarind water. He sips, nods, clears his throat, and continues. Click. Truth repeats itself. He says it's softer this time, not from exhaustion but understanding. Something shifts in the air. Maybe he's getting it. Maybe he always knew, and just forgot. Or maybe he's just trying to survive until the final click. You notice a stone tablet leaning against the outer wall. It reads, "A lie spoken once may be forgotten. A lie repeated becomes a habit. A habit becomes the wheel." You shiver slightly. The sixth revolution is slower, more deliberate. The wheel resists a bit now, as if asking for permission to finish. But the man doesn't resist. He continues to speak, no longer fighting the rhythm. It's not a chant now. It's almost musical. Click. Let the words pass through you. Click. Not from you. The seventh revolution begins. The monks watch without speaking. The scribe sets down his brush. The torch flickers in a sudden breeze, casting the wheel's shadow across the stone path like a serpent coiled in language. The man finishes the final phrase. The wheel comes to a halt. Silence. One monk steps forward and touches his shoulder. "You have returned," the monk says simply. "The bindings are undone." The man rises slowly, bowing to the wheel, the monks, the torch, even the bench. He walks away without looking back, his steps measured, no longer stiff with pride. You remain a little longer. Then you rise too. The wheel of repetition doesn't spin for you tonight, but you carry the rhythm in your steps, the cadence of correction. One line repeating in your mind like a drum beat. Truth repeats itself, and it does. You follow the sound of hollow drums now, soft as thunder from a distance, echoing through the narrow stone corridors like an old heartbeat trying to wake up. The path curls behind the temple kitchens, past stacked clay jars and abandoned winnowing baskets, until you reach a long, low building that smells faintly of rice, ash, iron, and something else. Something sharp. Bitter. Like disappointment. That's been roasted slowly, over too many years. You've stumbled into the house of ashen oaths, and inside, someone is being forced to keep their word. It's a dim hall lit only by a central brazier, above which hangs a suspended urn filled with glowing charcoal and crumbled offerings bits of oath scroll, shredded cloth, and thin splinters of sandalwood. On the floor kneels a woman, barefoot, dressed in gray, her head shaved not for shame, but for clarity. Around her neck, a garland of dried betel leaves, and, in front of her, a stone bowl filled with ash and sticky resin. This is the oath, Eater's trial. You hear the tale whispered nearby. She made a vow to the guild of potters. A public vow, too, loud and ceremonial of those, "I shall never undercut my peers," declarations given with incense and rice cakes. And then, she did exactly that. Slashed her prices, sold to visiting merchants at cost, and even copied another potter's glaze recipe without permission. Now she's here. Because in the Khmer Empire, an oath isn't just a sentence, it's a spiritual bond, a sacred current. And if you break it, you are required not only to acknowledge the fracture, but to consume it, literally. She kneels in front of the ash bowl, her eyes fixed, her hands folded over her lap. The priest beside her chants the original vow, allowed not to shame her. but to call the words back into the air. Words, they believe, don't disappear when spoken. They hang around, they stick. And tonight, those sticky phrases are being gathered and given form. From a side table, a monk mixes a small amount of ash with honey and crushed herbs. He rolls it into a dark paste, molds it into a lozenge, and sets it on a lacquered tray. The woman takes it. She chews slowly, jaw tense, mouth full of dust and bitterness. No water allowed. Not until the paste is swallowed. One vow down. Then comes the second, this one related to her false claim that another potter had sabotaged her kiln. She accused him in public, loudly, passionately, and wrongly. More ash is prepared, different herbs. This one includes galangal root, known for its sting. She eats again. You can't help but wince. Historians still argue whether the oath-eater tradition came from Brahmin fire rituals or older agricultural customs. Some say it mimics early blood pacts, with the ash replacing flesh. Others believe it's about memory forcing the offender to physically internalize the thing they violated, so it can no longer be ignored or denied. Either way, the symbolism is hard to miss. You lie. You eat the weight of your lie. She eats 5 oaths total, each one recited, prepared, consumed. By the 3rd, her eyes water. By the 5th, her throat is dry, and the priest finally offers a sip of cooled tamarind juice. Not to comfort her, just to push it all down. After the last one, she must sit in silence for 33 minutes, the symbolic length of a broken lunar cycle. During this time, she's not allowed to speak, shift, or blink more than once every 10 breaths. It's harder than it sounds. You watch as her body twitches with the effort to stay still, to keep the ashes inside. The priest places an iron mirror in front of her simple, round, blackened from use. She is instructed to look at her reflection and say nothing. Just watch herself digest her own failure. A young boy next to you whispers, if she vomits, she must start over tomorrow, with more ash. You glance at him. He's eating sesame balls, unconcerned. After the 33rd minute, a bell rings, softly. Once, the woman bows 3 times to the brazier, to the priest, and to the empty air where her words used to live. She's then handed a new scroll, a new oath, same vow, same ink. But this time, with red edges, a sign that she's already failed, once. You ask the boy what happens if she breaks this one again. He grins. Then they make her write the whole guild's charter in ash ink, with her finger, on the floor. A silence passes between you both. That sounds appropriately miserable. As she leaves the hall, the scent of burnt herbs lingers behind, curling around the eaves like invisible threads of memory. You follow her out, but from a respectful distance, and even from here, you can tell she won't be making loud vows again anytime soon. The next time she speaks, it'll be in whispers, and probably not with a mouth full of ash. Dawn begins to stretch her fingers along the treetops, casting the city in pale blues and soft golds. But you're still walking, still pulled forward by the faint smell of earth and the quiet rumble of voices rising in ritual cadence. You think you've seen it all: pain, balance, ink, ash, but then you reach the courtyard of the Elephant Terrace, and there, in front of a half-crumbled pavilion and a ring of chanting villagers, you witness something unlike the others. Not chains, not scripts, not masks. Just a woman stoic, barefoot, and holding a heavy ceremonial plow. This is the field of correction. Not a field in the literal sense. It's a wide rectangular stretch of hardened earth within the palace complex, smoothed and swept, but intentionally left barren. It has no crops, no irrigation. It exists purely for symbolic cultivation, a place where the land isn't meant to grow but you are. The woman was once a land tax official for the province south of Angkor. Her failure? She falsely reported that a poor village was overdue on their rice yield. She collected extra levies, enforced by palace guards, and passed the grain on to local nobles likely in exchange for favors. The villagers, starving, sent word through a sacred messenger reed basket. That alone tells you how desperate they were. And so she's here, before the people, before the ancestors, and the land. Her punishment? Plow the field of truth, by herself, without animals, without shoes, and without rest until every line is carved. She grips the wooden handle with both hands. The yoke sits across her shoulders, dragging the plow blade behind her in a straight groove through the dirt. A monk walks behind, steady and silent, planting small clay markers into each furrow won. For each family she defrauded. There are 37. You don't need to ask how many passes she must make. She's on number 9. Historians still argue whether this punishment originated with peasant rituals or court symbolism. Some scholars say it's based on ancient rice blessing ceremonies, where officials would plow honesty into ceremonial earth before harvest began. Others argue it evolved from more punitive origins, perhaps inspired by Chinese field labor sentences or even older Khmer harvest superstitions, where ghosts of failed seasons demanded recompense. Whatever its source, the effect is humbling. With each step, the woman sinks into the dirt. Her feet blister against sun-baked clods. Her back strains under the weight of a tool meant for oxen. And yet, she doesn't pause. She can't. If she stops before the final marker is planted, the field is smoothed again by monks, and she starts over from zero. It's not designed to break the body. It's meant to loosen the roots of arrogance. A small crowd has gathered at the edge of some elders from the very province she harmed. They watch without jeering. There's no satisfaction in seeing someone sweat, only a communal understanding that balance is being restored. You notice a young girl among them. She holds a basket of uncooked rice in her arms. Every time the woman completes a row, the girl adds a pinch of rice to a ceremonial bowl near the entrance of the field. When the punishment ends, the entire bowl will be offered at the temple, symbolizing a return of stolen sustenance. You ask a monk nearby how long the punishment usually takes. He doesn't look away from the field. Depends on the weight of the lie. You nod, even though you're not sure if he meant that figuratively or not. Row 12. The woman stumbles. The plow tips slightly. A hush falls over the crowd. But she catches herself, adjusts, continues. Dirt clings to her arms, sweat streaks her cheeks, and the groove continues behind her like a scar across the land. By row 20, her steps become more rhythmicless human, more elemental, like wind carving a canyon. The chant of the monks never wavers. It's meant to keep her focused, to hold her accountable with every syllable. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Her body is the confession. Her footprints, the apology. At row 37, she reaches the final marker. The monk who followed her bows collects the last clay token and places it in the rice bowl. The chanting stops. The field falls silent. Just the rasp of breath and the steady settling of dust. She bows to the field once, then twice, then falls to her knees and touches her forehead to the soil, not out of exhaustion, out of respect. The bowl of rice is lifted high by a temple boy and carried toward the shrine at the far end of the terrace. The woman remains behind, still kneeling, her hands resting on the warm, furrowed earth. You feel the weight of it. All the sweat, the steps, the truth carved into the dirt. She didn't need chains. She just needed the land to remind her what honesty costs. You glance down at your own feet and wonder what truths you've stepped over too lightly. The crowd disperses. Slowly, quietly, the field stays, waiting for the next lie to be plowed away. The sun finally peeks over the eastern canopy, spilling gold across the moss-covered walls like paint across crumbling parchment. The temple stones radiate heat almost instantly, waking lizards and monks alike. Roosters call in the distance, and steam rises from freshly drawn water pots. You should feel relief, maybe even peace, but you've learned better. If anything, daylight just casts the punishments in sharper focus. And today, the first comes with music. Not the soft temple drum kind. This is louder, measured, percussive. A hollow ta-ta-ta sound, punctuating each beat like a hammer of memory. You follow the rhythm to a shaded courtyard behind the jewel crafter's compound. There, in full view of artisans and apprentices, sits a man with a drum in his lap and humiliation in his eyes. This is the drum of disclosure, and the beat is his own doing. The man is a metal stamp artisana, respected one even. His tools once bore the royal mark, but he broke trust in a very specific way. He stamped a false certification onto a bundle of iron tools, passing off lower-quality blades as elite-grade goods. The deception might have gone unnoticed if one of the farmers who bought them hadn't returned weeks later with a bent sickle and a bleeding hand. Now, he's been called to confess with rhythm. The punishment is as theatrical as it is painful. The man must sit, barefoot and kneeling, in the center of a woven mat shaped like a lotus blossom. In front of him, a hollow-bodied confession drum carved from teak with a thin leather membrane. Painted across the top in red ink are glyphs for voice, echo, and truth. His job is to drum while reciting every detail of his deception aloud, repeatedly, for 3 full hours, without pause. If he misses a beat, he must start the confession again. If he misquotes himself, add 15 minutes. If he stops to cry or plead, another hour. You sit near a small cluster of apprentices, barely teenagers, whose eyes are glued to the performance. Their teacher leans in and mutters. They learn better when they feel the rhythm of regret. The man strikes the drum. Ta, ta, ta. I certified 12 blades I did not inspect. Ta, ta, ta. I marked them with the lotus seal, though they were flawed. Ta, ta, ta. I sold them knowingly, for twice the village price. His voice cracks by the end of the sentence, but the rhythm never falters. This isn't poetry. This is percussion as punishment. Speech as percussion. Truth as melody. Historians still argue whether this tradition began with court musicians or village trials. Some believe the drum's origins lie in warrior training rituals, where soldiers were forced to repeat oaths in tempo to learn discipline. Others suggest it emerged from theater, where flawed actors had to rebeat their parts as penance for ruining performances. Over time, it bled into law. And once it did, no lie could hide behind silence again. The artisan continues, sweat streaking his jaw, back straight despite the weight of the drum. Every now and then, a senior monk steps in to strike a bell, marking each half hour. The apprentices write each new sentence on clay tablets so they can study his rhythm, later proof that memory and morality must be practiced with equal dedication. You ask a guard quietly, "What happens when he finishes?" The guard shrugs. If he finishes, his tools are returned, but only for mending work. No stamping, no claims. He becomes hands only, never a voice. You nod. A fair sentence. The confession grows stranger as it stretches on. Less about the lie, and more about the why. Ta ta ta. I feared losing the temple's favor. Ta ta ta. I wanted my family to see me as more than a maker. Ta ta ta. I thought one lie would disappear in the sale. You feel that one in your chest. The apprentices whisper among themselves. One says, "It's like watching the soul untangle." By the final hour, the artisan's voice has thinned to a rasp, but his hands never lose tempo. He's no longer performing for the crowd, he's playing to match something deep within, as if each beat draws poison out of his body. At last, the monk strikes the final bell. The artisan stops. His hands fall limp over the drum's edge. The courtyard holds its breath. Then, gently, he bows forward, presses his forehead to the membrane of the drum, and whispers something you can't hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe an apology to the tools he betrayed. Two monks step in and lift the drum away. He's escorted not into exile but into a workshop behind the hall. You spot a sign above the door, the room of honest repairs. It's where flawed tools are made useful again, and flawed men. You glance down at your own hands. Wonder what they've built, what they've broken, and whether your rhythm would falter under such a gaze. You hear one final ta-ta-ta echo from the hall, faint and fading. Then silence. The day stretches on, and with it, the city returns to motion carts, creak down narrow paths, temple boys sweep petals from the steps, and somewhere, someone drops a stack of copper bowls with a ringing clang that echoes all the way into the libraries. But even with the bustle, there's one corner of Angkor that feels heavier than the rest. Older, less forgiving. You arrive at a gate, carved with looping patterns of water serpents and sky spirits, flanked by stone statues whose eyes seem just a little too judgmental. Beyond it lies the Hall of the Last Tongue. And inside, someone is practicing the art of not speaking. This punishment is called the silent spiral. It's for a specific kind of offender, the compulsive deceiver. Not someone who lied once to save face or out of fear, but someone who built stories, whole narratives, false accusations, whisper campaigns that, if left unchecked, could upend entire districts. The man at the center of this spiral, he told stories about a temple treasurer claimed he was skimming gold, redirecting alms, lining secret coffers under his sleeping mat. None of it was true, but it sounded true. And worse, it spread. The treasurer was nearly exiled before the lie unraveled, and now the storyteller finds himself here, in a spiral of his own making. The hall is massive, circular, its stone floor etched with an intricate labyrinthine pattern, thin grooves, inlaid with black resin. At the very center is a single mat, but he doesn't get to sit on it yet. He starts at the outer edge, and must walk the spiral slowly, silently, 1 foot at a time, hands folded, eyes down. No sound may leave his lips, no gesture of complaint or explanation. If he speaks, sneezes, hums, or even clears his throat, he starts over, and each circuit of the spiral grows narrower, the turns tighter, the path more confining. The idea is simple. If your tongue misled others, then your feet must now speak for you. Step by step, circle by circle, until you reach the middle, where at last you may be silent with purpose, not as punishment. Historians still argue whether the spiral is symbolic of Buddhist mandalas or a repurposed cosmological diagram. Some say it reflects the wheel of karma, every lie, adding another turn. Others think it evolved from an old punishment used in theatrical troupes, where failed storytellers were made to walk the silence before being allowed to perform again. You sit beside a scribe whose only job is to listen. He's stone-faced, but keen-eared. If he hears anything out of place, he rings a tiny bronze chime that signals failure. So far, it's been 30 minutes. The man hasn't faltered once. He walks like someone rehearsing regret. His steps are small, deliberate. You notice how his sandals leave faint prints on the stone, and how the breeze from open archways carries in the scent of old paper, lemon balm, and something fainter, maybe humility. The path narrows. He adjusts his posture. Sweat beads on his brow. Still, no sound. Halfway in, he nearly trips on a loose pebble. You hear his breath catch, but it never escapes. He closes his eyes, waits, then keeps walking. By the time he reaches the center mat, nearly an hour has passed. And then comes the second part. He kneels on the mat, folds his hands, and opens his mouth not to speak, but to receive. A monk steps forward and places a dried fig on his tongue. It's a symbolic sealing, sweet, chewy, and entirely silent. He may not speak again until sunset. If he does, the spiral begins anew. You watch as he sits there, eyes closed, fig dissolving slowly, not just tasting silence but absorbing it. A boy beside you whispers, "Will he be allowed to speak tomorrow?" You nod. If he listens today, as the crowd files out, you linger, watching the man alone at the spiral's heart. He's not bound, not scolded, but the gravity of stillness feels stronger than any shouting would have been. Sometimes, the harshest correction isn't noise, it's absence. You leave the hall without a word, not because you're forbidden, because suddenly you understand why you should. You leave the hall of the last tongue without a sound, your footsteps suddenly feeling too loud against the stone, as if the silence inside has followed you out and clung to your ankles. The sky has begun to fade into its late afternoon hues, now molten orange, and a red so deep it seems to soak into the rooftops. Somewhere nearby, temple gongs echo softly to mark the waning day, but there's still one more place the city wants to show you before dusk takes hold. You arrive at a wide wooden platform tucked behind the palace kitchens, shaded by tall banana trees and guarded by woven reed screens. On the surface, it seems almost tranquil, almost domestic. But your gut tells you otherwise. Because here, under the open sky, a punishment is playing out that might seem the most harmless at a glance yet carries a deeper sting than most. This is the mock market, and at the center of it stands a man holding a tray of nothing. Not literal nothing, of course. There are lumps of clay shaped into food, bits of fabric tied like coin purses, even painted gourds masquerading as spices. But it's all fake. The crowd gathered here knows it, and more importantly, he knows it. Because he's being punished for dishonest trade-selling spoiled goods to the infirmary during a sacred fast. Rotten vegetables disguised with incense. Rice bulked with pebbles. Meat salted to hide the smell of rot. The offense didn't just steal from monks, it jeopardized the health of those too weak to complain. And so now, he must sell fake wares in full sincerity, for as long as the sun remains above the edge of the terrace. He wears a full vendor's outfit, hat and all, and shouts prices as if the gourds are real. Passers-by stop, inspect the mock goods, and loudly haggle, mocking his exact style of deception. Children giggle and offer pretend coins. Elders shake their heads in mock dismay. One man waves a clay chicken under his nose and says, "Does this smell like honor to you?" The seller bows and replies, "Only the freshest shame, good sir." It's theater, but it's also penance. Each sale he makes, he must follow it by declaring the truth. This item is false. May my word never be again. He does this 50, 60 times. His voice never cracks, but his shoulders slump just slightly more with every exchange. Historians still argue whether the mock market began as folk punishment or royal satire. Some say it emerged from traveling plays, where corrupt officials were lampooned with fake auctions. Others insist it's rooted in village justice, where those who watered the wine or hoarded salt were forced to reenact their sins until no one could forget. Either way, it works. You watch as the punishment drags on. It's not physically painful, but it drains him. There's something exhausting about having to replay your wrongdoing again and again for public correction, especially when it requires you to smile through it. At one point, a monk purchases a bundle of air, and when the man hands it over with a bow, the monk presses his palm to the vendor's chest. "This is what you emptied." It's a small gesture, but the man freezes for half a second. His face doesn't change, but his next sale is slower, softer. He begins offering apologies with each false item. This is false. I knew it then. I know it now. This pouch holds nothing, just like my word did. A child offers him a painted wooden coin in return. He hesitates, takes it, then drops it into a small brass bowl beside his stand, where the rest of the coins lie. That bowl will be taken to the temple when the market closes. Symbolic payment to the gods of commerce, humility, and regret. You wonder aloud if he's learned anything. A nearby woman replies, "Maybe not yet, but ask him again tomorrow when he touches real rice." That stays with you. As the sun kisses the horizon and paints the scene in final gold, the mock market slowly winds down. The man places each fake item back into his satchel. He bows to the last customers. He steps down from the stall, and as he leaves, someone from the infirmary, an older woman, offers him a real pear. Not forgiveness, not quite, but food. And that, in this city of layered symbols, speaks louder than any sentence. You stay behind a moment longer, watching as the breeze kicks up and rustles the reed screens. One blows inward and collapses, revealing a mural painted on the back wall. It shows two hands, one giving fruit, the other offering air. Underneath it reads, "Barter with honesty, or you will sell only echoes." You step away from the platform and into the cooling night, stomach growling slightly. Somehow, you feel like you've earned that hunger. You continue through the twilight, where Angkor's edges begin to blur in the softening light. Shadows lean long across the temple walls, and the air smells of charcoal fires, river silt, and jasmine just beginning to bloom. The day is not done, but it's folding inward now, like a scroll reaching its final turns. And you follow a thin procession of villagers to a quiet glade just beyond the palace districton. Unlikely place for what you're about to see. Tonight, you've arrived for the public embodiment. At the center of the glade is a wooden frame, a sort of wide-standing tablet, carved with floral spirals, sunbursts, and the faces of mythical nagas. Standing beside it is a man dressed not in prisoner's garb, but in costume, and not just any costume, but that of the man he falsely accused. Yes, that's his punishment. He must spend the day acting as the man whose life he tried to ruin. Impersonation as apology. He accused his neighbor of stealing bricks from the royal quarry. Not a small crime. Quarry theft was taken seriously. Temple stones weren't just material, they were offerings to gods. To suggest someone had pilfered them was tantamount to labeling them spiritually bankrupt. The accused man had been interrogated, humiliated, nearly banished until a quarry foreman stepped forward and proved the stones were never missing at all. So now the accuser is here, playing the role of the falsely accused before the very community he slandered. It starts with attire. He wears the victim's work robe, dyed in quarry blue, and a woven tool belt with imitation chisels. He must spend the entire day doing the job, hauling rocks, reciting masonry prayers, sharpening tools he never actually used. But that's not the worst of it. Every time someone walks past, they are encouraged to ask, "Did you steal the stone?" And he must answer, "Number." But I carried the weight of a lie. Historians still argue whether this ritual began as royal satire or deeper restorative justice. Some scholars trace it back to folk plays, where roles of wronged citizens were reenacted by their accusers. Others argue it evolved from animist practices, where balance had to be restored not just spiritually, but socially, with the community witnessing the act. You sit on a rock beneath a tamarind tree and watch as the man drags a large log across the packed dirt of the glade. He stumbles. No one helps. That's part of it. A boy yells out the question. He pauses, turns. Number. But I carried the weight of a lie. Again. And again. Each time, his voice a little steadier, a little more present. Then comes the next part. He must rebuild a ruined shrine, symbolically of course. A miniature replica, no more than 3 feet high, composed of clay bricks with sacred syllables etched into them. For every brick he places, he must speak one quality that the falsely accused man actually possessed. He is generous. He works before dawn. He prays even for those who mock him. There are 17 bricks. By the end, his voice shakes. And when the final brick is placed, he bows not once, but 3 times, to the shrine, to the man he wronged, who stands silently at the edge of the glade, and to the crowd who has witnessed every act. You ask a villager beside you if he'll be forgiven. She shrugs. That's not our decision. But now he knows what it costs to wear another man's truth. The falsely accused man steps forward, not to embrace or condemn, but to remove the costume. Carefully, piece by piece, he undresses the offender. It's ritualistic, like peeling away a false story, until only the real man remains. He hands him back his own plain clothes. No words are exchanged. They walk in opposite directions. You stay a moment longer, watching the shrine glint under the setting sun. It's not perfect, some bricks crooked, one corner sagging slightly, but it stands. That seems to be enough. Just before you leave, you catch sight of the inscription carved into the base of the wooden frame. It reads, "A lie makes you taller than your neighbor, but justice returns you to your own height." You straighten your back and step away from the glade, just a little more grounded. Evening creeps in now like a careful cat, slow, quiet, and absolutely in control. The last rays of sunlight stretch through the tall palms, casting gold leaf shadows over the temple's weathered steps. You feel it in your bones, the city preparing for rest. But before night wraps itself fully around Angkor, you find yourself drawn to one final courtyard where something different is underway. No drums, no chants, no masks or wheels, just a single man, a large bowl of water, and a mirror. This is the reflection sentence, and it's among the most intimate and quietly brutal of all Khmer punishments. You sit at the edge of the circle, where lanterns flicker gently and smoke coils upward from pale coils of incense. A hush fills the air, not imposed but understood. The man, kneeling in the center, is facing his own reflection, held not in a polished plate of metal or glass, but in a still bowl of water. Moonlight glimmers faintly on its surface. His crime? A false confession, not of something he did, but of something he claimed to have done, bragging, exaggerating, inventing offenses to gain status among the city guards. He claimed to have caught a spy, to have uncovered a plot, to have personally struck down a thief with ceremonial grace. But every tale was a fiction crafted, not to deceive justice, but to elevate his own image. And so, the court stripped him of status, of armor, of voice, and left him only with his reflection. For this sentence, he must kneel at the bowl until his words calm the water. That's it. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Except that he must speak every lie he told, aloud, exactly as he told it. Each one creates ripples in the water, and only when the surface goes perfectly still can he begin to correct each lie, again aloud but softly, evenly, and with humility. If the water trembles or splashes, he must start over from the first lie. It's punishment by disturbance. Historians still argue whether the practice originated in Vedic meditation or indigenous Khmer rituals involving water spirits. Some believe it mimics the old animist belief that water records human speech, that rivers remember what's said above them. Others think it's a psychological mirror, forcing the offender to face the most dangerous distortions, their own stories. You lean closer. The man begins. I said I caught a spy outside the north gate. The water quivers slightly. I said the spy had a knife and that I wrestled it from him. A ripple. Small, but visible. I said the king praised me before the court. Another ripple. He stops. Wet. Watches. It takes nearly 5 minutes for the water to calm. Then, he begins again. This time slower. I said I caught a spy outside the north gate. The water barely stirs. I said the spy had a knife. A tiny tremor, but he breathes, slows, continues. When all the lies are listed, and the water finally rests, he whispers the truth. I was not at the north gate. I saw no spy. The man was a fisherman. He asked for water. I made it a tale. You don't realize you're holding your breath until the surface of the bowl stills completely. It reflects his face now tired, shaven, eyes wet but not from crying, just from looking too long at what he pretended to be. A priest nearby makes a quiet note on a palm leaf tablet. One by one, the monks extinguish the lanterns, not with a wave or breath, but with a touch to the water. Each flame hisses out as the priest dips a finger and lets a single droplet fall onto each lamp's wick. When it's dark, the man rises. He's not paraded, not mocked, not marked. He's simply sent home. There's no ceremony, no dramatic end, because this wasn't a performance. This was a return to zero. And as you step back into the outer path, listening to the frogs begin their nighttime chorus and the rustling of banana leaves overhead, you understand why this might be the harshest punishment of all. No wounds, no spectacle, just a man, a bowl of water, and the lies he told to feel important. And the strange, unshakable silence that follows when the water finally forgives him. You know it's the end, not because a drum sounds or a guard waves you on, but because the air itself changes. Even the insects seem quieter now, their song softening to a sleepy whir. The stars above Angkor begin to blink fully into view, winking through the haze of heat and incense. You've seen crocodile moats and oath paste, spiral walks and silent bowls of water. You've walked the narrow line between justice and spectacle. And yet there is one final corner left, a place where punishments are whispered about but rarely witnessed. The Khmer call it the Forgotten Cella Chamber, hidden beneath the smiling towers of Bayon Temple. You wouldn't have found it if you weren't looking closely. Down a narrow hallway lined with faded carvings, behind a false panel in the wall, lies a stone stairwell that disappears into darkness. The only light is a flickering oil lamp cradled in a shallow bowl. You descend carefully, one step at a time, the air cooling with every footfall, until the sounds of the surface vanish entirely. And there it is, a chamber no larger than a monk's cell, carved into the living rock, sealed on 3 sides, with a narrow vertical slit cut into the far wall. Not quite a window, not quite an escape, just enough to let in a blade of moonlight and the scent of wet moss. This place isn't for the loud or the broken. It's reserved for those whose crimes were so subtle, so insidious, that the empire itself didn't know how to categorize them. Quiet manipulators, schemers, poisoners of thought and rumor. Here, they are left not with chains or fire, but with time. Lots of time. No tormentors, no interrogators, no list of oaths to recite, just a single inscription on the wall above the stone bench. This is the echo of your influence. It is said that the prisoner is fed once daily, through a wooden chute. No human interaction, no speech, no name. The sentence, indefinite, not life imprisonment, not death. Something far stranger. A full confrontation with your own ripple. Historians still argue whether the forgotten cell was a myth, a cautionary tale whispered among nobles to scare them into silence. Some claim it never existed. Others believe there are still chambers hidden under the stones, where quiet figures once sat for years, decades even, thinking themselves back into the shape of honesty. One French explorer wrote that he found a chamber like this in the 1890s with the inscription still intact and a single sandal resting under the bench. Just one. Tonight, though, it's empty. You step inside, just for a moment, and let the air wrap around you. It smells of old lichen, dried ink, and time. The slit in the wall lets in a single thread of silver, landing squarely on the seat. You sit, briefly, and close your eyes. Not flames, not chains, not mocking crowds. And yet, stillness heavier than any punishment you've witnessed. You whisper something, just a word, and it vanishes into the stone, swallowed like it never existed. Maybe that's the point. Maybe this isn't about what you've done. Maybe it's about what remains after no one's watching. You rise, heart steady, breath slowed, and step back into the corridor. The oil lamp guttering, the inscription burning itself into memory. The echo of your influence. You reach the surface just as the last of the stars settle into place. The jungle hums, and the stone towers of Bayon stare into the sky with their frozen smiles, knowing too much, saying nothing. And now, finally, it's time to rest. You find yourself walking slower now. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because everything feels heavier in the best way, like you've walked through layers of history, through smoke and sandalwood, dust and ink, and something sacred has settled in your chest. The city of Angkor breathes around you, softer now, as if it's folding itself into sleep. The stars above are steady, the ground cool beneath your feet, and your mind, once cluttered with questions and noise, begins to hush itself gently, naturally. You think of the man who walked in spirals, of the fig placed on a tongue in silence, of bricks laid one by one in apology. You think of all the strange, symbolic, theatrical, tender, exhausting ways a society tried to find balance. Not through cruelty, through reminder. Maybe that's all justice, is reminding someone of who they were before the error, before the lie, before the disguise. Maybe it's not about pain, but about pause. The breeze is soft against your face now. Somewhere nearby, a bamboo wind chime whispers. A frog plops lazily into a pond, and the air smells faintly of jasmine and wet stone. Let it all go. You don't need to carry the wheel, the drumbeat, or the whisper anymore. You've heard the stories, seen the echoes. Now, close your eyes. Let the past slip away like incense, smoke through your fingers. The city is sleeping now. And you should too. Good night, traveler of truths. Sweet dreams.